The morning sun cast its golden rays across the Nile, painting the water in hues of amber and copper as Khenti stood at the edge of his shipyard, his calloused hands gripping a piece of acacia wood that would never be good enough for what he dreamed of creating. For acacia was the wood of common vessels, of fishing boats and cargo barges that plied the great river, carrying grain and pottery and all manner of mundane goods. But Khenti dreamed of something far greater, something that would carry the name of Pharaoh himself across the waters to distant lands, a vessel worthy of the gods, and for such a creation only the cedars of Byblos would suffice. Those magnificent trees that grew in the mountains beyond the great sea, their wood so fragrant and strong that it was said the gods themselves had planted them at the dawn of creation. Khenti had inherited this shipyard from his father Ahmose, who had inherited it from his father before him, 3 generations of shipwrights who had served the merchants and nobles of Thebes with dedication and skill, building sturdy vessels that navigated the Nile's treacherous currents during the inundation and the calmer waters of the dry season alike. But Khenti wanted more than to simply continue the family tradition. He wanted to elevate it, to create something so magnificent that his name would be remembered long after the stones of his workshop had crumbled to dust. And the key to this ambition lay in the precious cedar wood from Byblos, a city far to the north where Phoenician traders controlled the flow of this most valuable timber. For months, he had been negotiating with a merchant named Ymir, a Phoenician who traveled between Byblos and Egypt with regularity, bringing not only cedar but also fine wines, oils, and other luxuries that the Egyptian nobility craved. And after much discussion and the exchange of silver that had depleted Khenti's savings accumulated over years of careful management, Ymir had agreed to arrange regular shipments of cedar, enough to allow Khenti to begin work on his masterpiece, a ceremonial barge that would be presented to the temple of Amun-Ra, a gift so magnificent that it would surely attract the attention of Pharaoh's own court and elevate Khenti's status from mere craftsman to master shipwright of royal commission. The first shipment had arrived 3 months ago, 20 logs of the finest cedar, their rich reddish wood and intoxicating scent filling the workshop with promise. And Khenti had begun the meticulous work of selecting and shaping the timbers, each cut planned with mathematical precision. Each joint designed to fit so perfectly that not even a papyrus sheet could slide between the pieces. But then the trouble had started, subtle at first, easy to dismiss as mere misfortune. The second shipment had been delayed by 2 weeks. Ymir sending apologetic messages about storms at sea and difficulties in the harbor at Byblos. Explanations that seemed reasonable enough, though they frustrated Khenti's carefully planned construction schedule. But when the third shipment failed to arrive at all, and Ymir himself could not be found in any of his usual haunts in Thebes or Memphis, Khenti began to suspect that something more sinister was at work. He had made inquiries, carefully and discreetly at first, not wanting to alarm his workers or give his competitors any hint of his troubles, speaking to the harbor masters and the merchants who traded in timber. And what he learned had filled him with a cold fury that even now, standing in the morning light with the sounds of his workshop beginning to stir behind him, made his hands clench until his knuckles turned white. For it seemed that Userhet, the master of the rival shipyard that lay just upriver from Khenti's own establishment, had been systematically interfering with his cedar shipments, bribing harbor officials to delay inspections, spreading rumors among the Phoenician trading community that Khenti was unreliable in his payments, even going so far as to attempt to purchase Ymir's entire stock of cedar at inflated prices, ensuring that none would reach Khenti's workshop. Userhet had always been a rival, their 2 shipyards competing for the same contracts, the same clients, the same recognition. But this was different. This was not mere competition, but deliberate sabotage. And Khenti knew that if he did not act decisively, his dream of creating the great ceremonial barge would die, his reputation would suffer, and worse, he might lose the shipyard entirely. For he had invested so much in this project, both in silver and in promises to his workers and suppliers, that failure would mean financial ruin. Userhet's shipyard was larger than Khenti's, employing twice as many workers and maintaining relationships with some of the wealthiest merchants in Thebes. Men who appreciated Userhet's willingness to cut corners and deliver vessels quickly even if the quality sometimes suffered, but what Userhet lacked in craftsmanship he made up for in political connections. His brother-in-law serving as a scribe in the Temple of Karnak, his cousin holding a position in the office that managed royal construction projects, these connections giving Userhet access to contracts and information that should have been available to all qualified shipwrights, but somehow always seemed to flow in his direction first. Khentiamentiu had always prided himself on winning contracts through the quality of his work rather than through political maneuvering. His vessels were known throughout Thebes for their durability and elegant lines. Several of the city's most prominent merchants refused to commission ships from anyone else. But this approach, while honorable, had left him with fewer allies in the corridors of power, fewer friends who could intervene when a rival decided to play dirty, and now he was paying the price for his independence, his integrity, becoming a liability, in a world where success often depended more on who you knew than what you could create with your hands. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie, and he turned to see Neferu approaching, his master carpenter and the most skilled craftsman in the workshop, a man who had worked alongside Khentiamentiu's father and had taught Khentiamentiu himself much of what he knew about the art of shipbuilding. Neferu's face was creased with concern, the morning light emphasizing the deep lines that years of squinting at measurements and breathing sawdust had etched into his weathered features, and Khentiamentiu knew without asking that more bad news had arrived. For Neferu only wore that particular expression when the gods seemed to be testing their patience beyond all reasonable limits. "The Carpenters' Guild has sent a message," Neferu said without preamble, his voice rough as the acacia bark they peeled from the logs. "They want to inspect our workshop. They say there have been complaints about the quality of our work, about unsafe practices and violations of the guild standards." He paused, his eyes meeting Khentiamentiu's with shared understanding, for both men knew exactly who had lodged such complaints and why. "The inspection is scheduled for 3 days from now, and you know as well as I do that if they want to find violations, they will find them. Every workshop in Thebes has some practice that could be construed as bending the rules. It is simply a matter of whether the inspectors choose to overlook minor infractions or to make an example of someone." Khentiamentiu felt the anger rising in his chest like the Nile during inundation, threatening to overflow its banks and sweep away everything in its path. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think rather than simply react. For rage would serve no purpose here except to cloud his judgment, and he needed clarity now more than ever. Userhet arranged this. He said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "He knows that the ceremonial barge project has stretched our resources, that we cannot afford delays or fines. And he knows that if the guild finds violations and shuts us down even temporarily, we will lose contracts, our workers will seek employment elsewhere, and our reputation will suffer damage that might take years to repair." He looked out across the Nile, watching a fisherman cast his net in the shallows. The simple act, a reminder that life continued in its patterns, regardless of human schemes and ambitions. We need to get ahead of this. We need to turn Userhet's strategy against him. But we also need to secure the cedar shipments, or all of this becomes irrelevant, because without the cedar, there is no ceremonial barge. And without the ceremonial barge, there is no future for this shipyard. Neferu nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. For he had survived in this trade for 40 years by being not just a skilled craftsman, but also a shrewd judge of situations and opportunities. "I have a thought," he said carefully. "My nephew works in the harbor at Memphis. He handles the customs inspections for timber imports. He might know what happened to Ymir and whether there are other Phoenician traders we could approach. But more importantly, he would know if Userhet has been bribing officials and manipulating the system, and if we could prove such corruption, well, the guild takes a very dim view of members who bring outside authorities into what should be internal trade matters." He let the implication hang in the air between them, a suggestion that they fight fire with fire, corruption with exposure of corruption. Though both men felt uneasy about descending to Userhet's level, for it went against everything Khentiamentiu's father had taught him about conducting business with honor and letting one's work speak for itself. Contact your nephew, Khentiamentiu decided. But tell him to be discreet. We cannot afford to alert Userhet that we are investigating his activities. Not yet. Not until we have solid proof and a plan for how to use it. He paused, considering their options. In the meantime, prepare the workshop for the guild inspection. I want everything perfect. Every tool in its place. Every safety procedure documented and visible. I want our workshop to be so exemplary that even inspectors looking for violations will struggle to manufacture credible complaints. He turned to face Neferu fully, his expression grim but determined. And I will go to Memphis myself. I will find Ymir, or learn what became of him. And I will secure cedar wood even if I have to travel to Byblos myself and carry it back log by log on my own shoulders. The journey to Memphis took 2 days by river, Khentiamentiu traveling on one of his own vessels, a sturdy cargo boat that he had built 5 years earlier for a grain merchant who had since become one of his most loyal clients. The merchant had agreed to let Khentiamentiu use the boat whenever needed, a gesture of friendship that now proved invaluable as he navigated the political and commercial waters that had become as treacherous as the Nile's most dangerous cataracts, and as the boat cut through the current. Khentiamentiu stood at the prow, watching the landscape slide past, the green strip of fertile land on either side of the river, giving way periodically to the golden desert beyond, the eternal contrast that defined Egypt. Life and death existing side by side, separated only by the blessing of water, and he wondered if his own fate hung in such a balance, whether his shipyard would flourish or wither depending on his success in securing the cedar that had become as precious to him as water to a crop of barley. Memphis rose before him on the 3rd morning, the ancient capital sprawling along the western bank of the Nile, its white walls gleaming in the sun, the great pyramid of Djoser visible in the distance at Saqqara, a reminder of Egypt's glory and the ambitions of those who had come before, men who had also dreamed of creating something that would outlast their mortal lives. And Khentiamentiu felt a kinship with those ancient builders, even as he acknowledged the hubris in comparing his ceremonial barge to the eternal monuments of the Pyramid Age. Yet was not all creation an act of defiance against time and death, an assertion that human skill and vision could produce something worthy of remembrance, something that justified the brief span of years granted to each person under the sun? The harbor at Memphis was chaos incarnate. Dozens of vessels crowded against the docks, sailors and merchants shouting in a babel of languages, Egyptian mixing with Phoenician, Nubian, and tongues from even more distant lands. The air thick with the smell of fish and spices, tar and rope, the fundamental odors of maritime commerce that had probably changed little since the first boat had been hollowed from a log and set upon the water. And Khentiamentiu made his way through the crowds with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life around boats and those who sailed them, his eyes scanning the docks for any sign of Phoenician traders, for the cedar merchants usually clustered together in a particular section of the harbor where they could share information about prices and conditions in the Levantine ports from which they had come. He found them eventually, a group of 5 merchants gathered around a brazier despite the heat, drinking wine and gesturing animatedly as they conducted their business in that peculiar mixture of multiple languages that characterized trade in the ancient world. And Khentiamentiu approached with the respectful distance that protocol demanded, waiting to be acknowledged rather than rudely interrupting. And after a moment, one of the merchants, a heavy-set man with a beard braided in the Phoenician style and eyes that assessed Khentiamentiu with the calculating gaze of one who made his living reading the intentions of strangers, gestured for him to approach, and asked in accented Egyptian what brought a shipwright to the docks of Memphis. "I seek information about a trader named Ymir," Khentiamentiu said. "He was supposed to deliver cedar to my workshop in Thebes, but the shipments have stopped and Ymir himself has disappeared. I need to know what happened and whether there are other traders who might be willing to supply the cedar I need for a very important commission." He was careful to keep his tone neutral, neither accusing nor desperate, though he felt both emotions churning in his gut, for he knew that merchants could smell desperation like jackals scented a wounded animal, and if they sensed how badly he needed the cedar, they would drive the price up until it became impossible to afford. The Phoenician merchant exchanged glances with his companions, a silent communication that Khentiamentiu could not fully interpret, but which suggested that his question had touched on something they already knew, something that perhaps made them uncomfortable. And after a long pause, the merchant said, "Ymir is dead. His boat sank 3 weeks ago, off the coast near Byblos. They say it was a storm, but there are always storms, and Ymir had sailed those waters for 20 years. Some of us think it was not entirely natural, that perhaps someone arranged for his vessel to meet with misfortune. But these are dangerous speculations, and not the sort of thing one says too loudly, especially when wealthy men are involved and the money flowing through the cedar trade would tempt even the most honest soul to bend the rules of civilized conduct." The news hit Khentiamentiu like a physical blow. Ymir dead, the merchant who had promised to supply his cedar and who had seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the ceremonial barge project, gone beneath the waves, along with whatever cargo he had been carrying. And Khentiamentiu felt guilt mixing with his shock. For if Ymir's death had indeed been arranged by someone seeking to disrupt the cedar supply to Khentiamentiu's workshop, then an innocent man had paid with his life for Khentiamentiu's ambitions, a weight that settled on his shoulders like a yoke of stone. But he could not afford to indulge in grief or guilt, not now, not when so much depended on his ability to find an alternative source for the precious timber. "Who might have wanted Ymir dead?" Khentiamentiu asked, though he already suspected the answer. "And who among you might be willing to supply cedar to replace what he was bringing to me? I can pay a fair price, and I am a reliable customer. My reputation in Thebes is excellent, and I have never defaulted on a payment or broken a contract." He was aware that he was now selling himself like a merchant hawking wares in the market, a position that would have humiliated his father, who had believed that quality work should seek the craftsman rather than the craftsman begging for opportunities. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Not with Userhet's sabotage threatening everything he had built. Another of the Phoenician merchants spoke up, a younger man with sharp features and the restless energy of someone who saw opportunity where others saw only risk. "There is a shipwright in Thebes named Userhet who has been very aggressive in buying up cedar. He pays above market price, which makes us happy to sell to him, but he also makes it clear that we should not sell to certain others. He has influence with the harbor authorities and can make life difficult for traders who displease him. Delays in inspections, questions about cargo manifests, the sort of petty harassment that costs time and money. Most of us have decided it is easier to simply avoid selling to those on Userhet's list, and I am sorry to say that your name is on that list, Khentiamentiu of Thebes. Userhet has made it very clear that any trader who supplies you with cedar will find their future business in Egypt severely compromised." The confirmation of what Khentiamentiu had suspected brought no satisfaction, only a deepening of the cold fury that had been growing in him since he first realized the extent of Userhet's campaign against him. His rival was not merely trying to outcompete him, but to destroy him completely, to eliminate him as a threat by cutting off his access to essential materials. And if Userhet was willing to go so far as to arrange the death of a Phoenician trader, then Khentiamentiu's own life might also be in danger, a sobering thought that made him more aware of the vulnerable position he had put himself in by coming to Memphis alone, without guards or allies, trusting in the civilized rules of commerce that Userhet had apparently decided no longer applied. "I need cedar," Khentiamentiu said flatly, "and I am willing to pay whatever price is necessary, and to provide whatever assurances you need that your business in Egypt will not suffer. I have contacts of my own, perhaps not as powerful as Userhet's, but significant nonetheless. Merchants and nobles who depend on my work and who would not appreciate seeing me driven out of business by a rival's underhanded tactics. If you supply me with cedar, I will make it worth your while, and I will also work to ensure that Userhet's influence over the harbor authorities is diminished, for corruption that affects one honest trader will eventually affect all traders, and it is in everyone's interest to see that business is conducted fairly rather than through threats and violence." The young Phoenician merchant seemed intrigued, his eyes calculesced, lating the risks and rewards of defying Userhet's implicit ban on trading with Khentiamentiu, and after a moment he said, "I am Danel. My family has been trading cedar for 3 generations. We have our own groves in the mountains above Byblos, and we do not depend as heavily on Egyptian business as some of the other traders, which gives us more freedom to choose our customers. I might be willing to supply you with cedar, but I would need assurances, real assurances, not just promises. I would need you to pay in advance, a significant deposit that would compensate me if Userhet's harassment makes it impossible to continue trading in Egypt, and I would need you to provide documentation of your contracts and your reputation, evidence that I can show to others to justify why I am taking this risk. Khentiamentiu nodded, his mind already working through what he could offer. The silver he had left was not much, but it might be enough for a deposit, if Denel's prices were reasonable and documentation would be easy enough to provide. He had letters from satisfied clients, records of contracts fulfilled on time and to specification, the accumulated proof of years of honest work. I can meet those terms, he said. I have some silver with me, and I can send for more from Thebes. As for documentation, I can have it prepared and delivered within a week. But I need to know that you can actually deliver the cedar, that you have access to sufficient quantity and quality, because I am building a ceremonial barge that must be perfect. Every plank must be without flaw. Every timber must be straight and strong. I cannot accept inferior wood simply because it is available. Denel smiled, the expression of a man who recognized a fellow perfectionist, someone who understood that true quality was worth whatever price had to be paid to achieve it. I can deliver what you need, he said. My family's groves produce some of the finest cedar in Byblos. We are selective in our cutting, and we know how to season the wood properly. But such quality comes at a cost. You would be paying premium prices even without the risk factor involved in defying Userhet's ban. Are you prepared for that? Can your commission really justify such expense? Or are you pursuing a dream that will bankrupt you even if you succeed in building your barge? It was a fair question, one that Khentiamentiu had asked himself many times in the dark hours of sleepless nights when doubt crept in like water through a poorly caulked hull, threatening to sink his confidence and his ambitions alike. But he had come too far to turn back now. He had invested too much of himself and his resources, and more than that, he had seen in his mind's eye what the ceremonial barge would look like when completed. A vision so vivid and compelling that it felt like prophecy rather than imagination, as though the gods themselves had planted the image in his thoughts and demanded that he bring it into being regardless of the cost. I am prepared, he said simply. The ceremonial barge will be my masterpiece. And yes, it may bankrupt me if things go wrong. But I would rather risk everything in pursuit of greatness than spend my life building adequate vessels that are forgotten the moment they sink or are broken up for scrap. We have one life, Denel. One chance to create something that matters, and I intend to seize that chance, even if it destroys me. Denel studied Khentiamentiu's face for a long moment, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation, and whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly and extended his hand in the Phoenician manner of sealing agreements, grasping Khentiamentiu's forearm in a grip that was firm and dry despite the heat. Very well, we have an understanding. I will arrange for a shipment of cedar to be delivered to your workshop in Thebes. 20 prime logs to start, each one personally selected by my father, who has an eye for timber that borders on the supernatural. He can look at a standing tree and tell you exactly how the grain will run, where the knots will form, which boards will warp, and which will remain true for 100 years. And I will give you a fair price, not cheap, but fair. Because I respect a man who pursues his vision with such dedication, and because frankly I am tired of Userhet's bullying tactics. He treats us Phoenician traders as though we were his servants rather than independent merchants, and it would give me great pleasure to see him brought down a level or two, to remind him that commerce depends on mutual respect rather than intimidation and threats. They spent the next hour negotiating the details of their arrangement, the price per log, the delivery schedule, the specifications for length and diameter, the method of payment, all the practical considerations that would transform their agreement from abstract principle into concrete reality. And Khentiamentiu found himself warming to Denel's straightforward manner. The young Phoenician had none of the obsequious flattery that characterized so many merchants, nor did he engage in the elaborate dancing around issues that often made negotiations feel like wading through mud. Instead, he stated his positions clearly, listened to Khentiamentiu's counter-arguments, and adjusted his terms when they made sense, the whole process taking on the character of two craftsmen, collaborating on a design rather than adversaries trying to extract maximum advantage from each other. When they finally reached an agreement that satisfied both parties, Khentiamentiu counted out half of his remaining silver as a deposit, the coins disappearing into Danel's leather purse with a soft jingling that represented both hope and risk in equal measure. Hope that the cedar would arrive as promised and allow him to continue work on the ceremonial barge, risk that something would go wrong, that Userhet would intercept the shipment, or that some other calamity would befall the precious cargo before it reached his workshop. But risk was inherent in any worthwhile endeavor. His father had taught him that. And a man who refused to take risks was a man who accomplished nothing worth remembering. As Khentiamentiu prepared to leave the harbor and begin the journey back to Thebes, Danel pulled him aside and spoke in a lower voice, glancing around to ensure they would not be overheard by the other merchants who had returned to their own conversations and business dealings. There is something else you should know. Something I heard from a trader who recently arrived from Byblos. There are rumors that Userhet is planning something significant. Some sort of grand gesture that will cement his position as the preeminent shipwright in all of Egypt. I do not know the details, but apparently he has been commissioning materials, not just cedar, but also gold, leaf, and precious stones, ebony from Nubia and ivory from the lands far to the south. The sorts of materials one uses not for ordinary vessels, but for something truly spectacular, something that would catch the attention of Pharaoh himself. And the timeline suggests he is trying to complete this project quickly, perhaps because he knows about your own plans for the ceremonial barge and wants to present his creation first, to steal the glory you have been working toward. The information sent a chill through Khentiamentiu despite the afternoon heat. The possibility that Userhet was not merely trying to sabotage his rival's work, but was actually racing to complete a similar project first, turning their competition into a desperate contest where the winner would gain everything and the loser would be left with nothing but debt and broken dreams. Do you know what kind of vessel he is building? Khentiamentiu asked, trying to keep the anxiety from his voice. Is it also a ceremonial barge, or something different? Something that might serve a different purpose, and therefore not directly compete with my own project? Danel shrugged, his expression sympathetic, but unable to provide the reassurance Khentiamentiu desperately wanted. The trader did not have specifics, only that Userhet has been very secretive about the project, working behind closed doors with only his most trusted craftsmen, and that he has been making offerings at the temple of Ptah, the patron god of craftsmen, asking for divine blessing on his work, which suggests he considers it tremendously important, possibly the defining achievement of his career. I tell you this not to discourage you but to warn you, because forewarned is forearmed, and you seem like a man who would rather face the truth, however unpleasant, than be blindsided by circumstances you could have anticipated if only you had known. Khentiamentiu thanked Danel for the information and for his willingness to supply the cedar despite the risks. And as he walked back through the crowded harbor toward where his boat was moored, his mind churned with this new intelligence, trying to assess what it meant for his own plans and how he should respond. If Userhet was indeed building his own ceremonial vessel, then simply completing the barge might not be enough. Khentiamentiu would need to ensure that his creation was so superior, so magnificent in every detail, that any comparison would clearly favor his work over whatever Userhet produced. And that meant he could afford no compromises, no shortcuts. Every element of the design and construction would need to be executed with absolute perfection, a standard that was difficult enough to achieve under ideal circumstances, but which became nearly impossible when working under the pressure of time constraints and rival sabotage. The journey back to Thebes seemed to pass more quickly than the voyage to Memphis had, perhaps because Khentiamentiu's mind was so occupied with planning and strategizing that he barely noticed the passing landscape, the sun's movement across the sky, the calls of the boatmen as they navigated around sandbars and other vessels, all the sensory details of river travel that normally would have engaged his attention. And when his boat finally tied up at the docks in Thebes as evening approached on the second day of travel, he felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, weary from the physical journey, but animated by a sense of urgency that made rest seem like an indulgence he could not afford. Neferu was waiting for him at the workshop, the old carpenter's face grave but not defeated, and Khentiamentiu knew before his master craftsman spoke that there had been developments during his absence. "The guild inspection went forward even though you were not here," Neferu reported. "They said they could not reschedule because the inspectors had other commitments, which is obvious nonsense since the guild serves its members rather than the other way around. But they came with their measuring tools and their scrolls, and they examined every corner of the workshop, and I am sorry to tell you that they found violations, or rather they claimed to find violations, minor issues that in any other workshop would be overlooked or corrected with a verbal warning, but which they have documented with great formality, and which they say require immediate remediation and a fine of 50 deben of silver. And furthermore, they have placed us on probationary status, which means they can return for another inspection at any time, and if they find continuing violations, they have the authority to suspend our license to operate until we come into full compliance with all guild standards." 50 deben of silver, Khentiamentiu thought with a sinking feeling. That was nearly all the money he had left after paying Danel's deposit. And coming into full compliance with guild standards, as interpreted by hostile inspectors, could mean extensive and expensive modifications to the workshop, new ventilation systems, different storage arrangements for materials, perhaps even structural changes to the building itself, all of which would cost time and money he did not have. What were the specific violations they cited? He asked, hoping that there might be room to challenge the findings, or at least to prioritize which issues needed to be addressed most urgently. Neferu handed him a scroll. The formal documentation of the inspection, written in the precise hand of a professional scribe, and as Khentiamentiu scanned the list of alleged violations, he felt his anger rising again, for it was clear that the inspectors had been instructed to find problems and had interpreted the guild standards in the most stringent possible manner, citing issues that were common practice in every shipyard in Egypt. The way they stored their tools, the ventilation in the wood seasoning shed, the proximity of the fire pit to the lumber stacks, all matters that involved judgment and reasonable interpretation rather than clear black and white rules, and all matters that could be construed as violations if an inspector was determined to find fault. "This is Userhet's doing," Khentiamentiu said, stating the obvious. He arranged the inspection, and he made sure the inspectors knew what they were supposed to find, probably greased their palms with enough silver to make them willing to compromise whatever professional integrity they might normally possess. And now he expects that between the fine and the cost of remediation, we will be bankrupted, or at least sufficiently weakened, that we cannot complete the ceremonial barge project. He looked at Neferu, seeing in the old carpenter's eyes the same determination that he felt in his own heart, the refusal to surrender even when circumstances seemed overwhelmingly against them. "We will not give him the satisfaction. We will find a way to pay the fine and make whatever changes are necessary, and we will complete the barge, not just adequately but brilliantly, so perfectly that no one who sees it can doubt that it represents the finest shipbuilding craftsmanship in all of Egypt." Neferu nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There is more," he said. "While you were in Memphis, 3 of our workers left to take positions at Userhet's shipyard. Right 4017. Workers left to better, workers left to." He offered them higher wages and promised them the prestige of working on a royal commission. Apparently, he has been telling everyone that Pharaoh himself has requested a special vessel and that Userhet's workshop has been chosen to build it. I do not know if this is true or merely another of his exaggerations. But the workers believed him, and they were worried that our own situation had become too unstable, that we might not be able to pay them regularly, or that the workshop might be shut down by the guild. So they took his offer, and I cannot entirely blame them for looking after their own interests, though it leaves us short-handed at a critical time. The loss of skilled workers was perhaps even more serious than the fine or the required modifications, Khentiamentiu thought, because craftsmanship could not be rushed or faked. You could not simply hire unskilled laborers off the street and expect them to produce work of the quality required for a ceremonial barge. Each worker represented years of training and experience, an understanding of how wood behaved, how joints should be fitted, how curves should be shaped, all the tacit knowledge that could not be written in scrolls or taught in formal lessons, but which had to be learned through patient practice under the guidance of master craftsmen. And losing 3 experienced workers meant that the remaining craftsmen would have to work longer hours and take on additional responsibilities, increasing the risk of errors and accidents that could ruin precious materials or set back the project's timeline. We will manage with the workers we have, Khentiamentiu decided, and we will recruit new apprentices, young men who are eager to learn and who will work hard for the opportunity to be part of something significant. Perhaps the loss of those 3 is actually a blessing in disguise, because if they were willing to abandon us at the first sign of difficulty, then they were not the kind of men we want working on the ceremonial barge anyway. This project requires absolute dedication, and I would rather have a smaller crew of loyal craftsmen than a larger group that includes potential traitors who might sabotage our work from within. Over the following days, Khentiamentiu threw himself into addressing the immediate crises facing his workshop, paying the guild fine with borrowed silver, securing loans from 2 merchant friends who trusted his reputation and his vision, even if they thought his obsession with the ceremonial barge was slightly mad, arranging for the required modifications to the workshop, hiring new apprentices, and beginning their training, all while continuing to work on the barge itself whenever he could spare an hour or 2. For the project could not be allowed to stall completely even while dealing with Userhet's sabotage. Every day of delay was a day that his rival might use to advance his own mysterious project, whatever it was. The cedar shipment from Nile arrived exactly when promised, 20 magnificent logs that filled the workshop with their distinctive scent, and Khentiamentiu spent an entire day examining each one, running his hands over the smooth reddish wood, checking for knots and irregularities, planning how each log would be cut and shaped to maximize its contribution to the barge's structure. And he had to admit that Nile had not exaggerated about his father's eye for timber. These were indeed prime specimens, the kind of wood that would still be sound and beautiful 1,000 years hence, that would carry the barge and its sacred cargo through whatever waters it sailed with strength and grace. But even as he worked with the cedar, planning and measuring and beginning the careful process of shaping the timbers, Khentiamentiu found his thoughts returning to what Daniel had told him about Userhet's secret project, the materials being commissioned, the secrecy, the offerings to Ptah. All of it suggested something extraordinary, and he realized that he needed to know more, needed to understand what his rival was planning, so that he could ensure his own work would surpass it. And that meant he needed intelligence, someone who could get inside Userhet's workshop and discover what was being built there behind those closed doors. The opportunity came in the form of Kawet, a young woman who sometimes worked as a scribe for various workshops in Thebes, recording inventories and contracts and other business matters. She was the daughter of a scribe who had served in the temple of Amun-Ra, educated in reading and writing and mathematics, skills that were rare enough among men and almost unheard of among women, which made her services valuable to workshops that needed documentation but could not afford to keep a full-time scribe on staff, and Khentiamentiu had employed her services several times over the years, always finding her work to be accurate and efficient, and, more importantly, he had observed that she was intelligent and observant, noticing details that others missed, and drawing connections that required a quick and analytical mind. He sought her out at her small house near the temple district, finding her in the courtyard grinding grain for bread, a domestic task that seemed incongruous with her scholarly abilities, but which she performed with the same focused attention she brought to her scribal work. And when he explained what he needed, her eyes lit up with interest. "You want me to get hired by Userhet's workshop and spy on his project?" she said, not as a question, but as a statement, cutting through his careful diplomatic phrasing to the core of what he was asking. "That is dangerous. If Userhet discovers that I am gathering information for you, he will be angry, and angry powerful men can make life very difficult for a woman who has no husband or father to protect her. But it is also interesting, and I confess I am curious about what he is building. The rumors have spread throughout Thebes, and everyone speculates, but no one knows for certain. And besides, I have never liked User-Het. He treats scribes as though we were merely tools to be used, rather than skilled professionals deserving of respect. So if I can help you and discomfort him at the same time, well, that seems like a worthwhile use of my time. They agreed on a price for her services, more than she would normally charge for scribal work, but reasonable given the risks she would be taking. And Khentiamentiu gave her careful instructions about what to look for, the dimensions of whatever vessel was being constructed, the materials being used, the timeline for completion, any details about the intended recipient or purpose, all information that would help him understand what he was competing against. And Cowett listened carefully, asking occasional questions to clarify exactly what he needed. And then she departed to arrange her introduction to User-Het's workshop, confident that she could convince them to hire her, for skilled scribes were always in demand, and she had a reputation for discretion and reliability that would make her an attractive candidate. While waiting for Cowett to gather intelligence, Khentiamentiu focused on making as much progress as possible on the ceremonial barge, working alongside Neferu and the other craftsmen to shape the cedar planks, fitting them together with the mathematical precision that had been the hallmark of his family's work for 3 generations. Each joint so perfect that when coated with resin, it would be completely watertight, each curve flowing smoothly into the next, the whole structure beginning to take shape like a sculpture emerging from stone under a master artist's chisel. And despite all the stress and worry of the past weeks, Khentiamentiu felt a deep satisfaction as he worked with the wood. This was what he had been born to do. This was where his skills and vision came together to create something that transcended mere utility and approached the realm of art. The barge was designed to be 40 cubits long and 8 cubits wide, large enough to carry a substantial cargo or a procession of priests and nobles, but not so large that it would be unwieldy to maneuver. The hull would be constructed of cedar planks, fitted edge to edge, in the ancient Egyptian manner, without the frames and ribs that shipwrights from other lands used, a technique that required extraordinary precision, but which produced a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to twist slightly with the stresses of the water without breaking. The prow would rise in a graceful curve, carved to resemble the head of a falcon, the sacred bird of Horus, while the stern would be shaped like the tail of the same bird, the symbolism connecting the vessel to divine protection and royal authority. And the entire exterior would be coated with a special mixture of resin and gold leaf, giving the barge a luminous quality that would make it appear to glow in the sunlight, as though lit from within by divine fire. The interior of the barge was to be even more elaborate, with a central cabin constructed of ebony and cedar, inlaid with ivory and turquoise in geometric patterns that represented the order of the cosmos. The ceiling of the cabin would be painted to resemble the night sky, with stars picked out in silver against a background of deep blue. And the floor would be covered with linen cushions dyed in precious purple, the color reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. All of these details carefully planned and documented in the drawings that Khentiamentiu had been refining for months, each element contributing to an overall design that was meant to inspire awe and reverence, to serve as a worthy conveyance for sacred relics, or for Pharaoh himself if the gods smiled upon the project and brought it to the attention of the royal court. 3 weeks after Cowett had infiltrated User-Het's workshop, she returned to Khentiamentiu with her report, meeting him in the evening at a small beer house near the docks, where their conversation would not attract attention, and what she told him was both illuminating and disturbing, confirming his worst suspicions about the nature of the competition he faced. User-Het is indeed building a ceremonial barge, she said, keeping her voice low despite the noise of other patrons drinking and laughing around them. And it is magnificent. I will not lie to you. He has spared no expense, and his craftsmen are skilled. The vessel is slightly larger than yours, 45 cubits long, and the design is similar in some ways, with a high curved prow and stern. Extensive use of gold, leaf, and precious materials. But there are differences too. where your design emphasizes elegance and mathematical precision. His emphasizes power and grandeur. It is more heavily decorated, almost ostentatious in its display of wealth. And he has incorporated elements from foreign designs, Nubian motifs, and Phoenician techniques, making it a kind of synthesis of different traditions, rather than a purely Egyptian vessel. Cowit paused to take a sip of her beer, her eyes scanning the room to ensure no one was paying undue attention to their conversation, and then she continued. But here is the most important piece of information. Userhet has already arranged a presentation of his barge to the High Priest of Amun-Ra, scheduled for 2 months from now during the festival of Opet, when the priest carry the sacred bark of Amun from Karnak to Luxor Temple, and he intends to propose that his barge be used in future festivals, replacing the old ceremonial vessels that have served for generations. And if the high priest accepts this proposal, then Userhet will effectively have a royal commission, because what the Temple of Amun-Ra endorses, Pharaoh himself typically approves, especially in matters of religious ceremony. And once he has that endorsement, any competing barge, no matter how beautiful or well-crafted, will be seen as redundant, unnecessary, a pointless duplication of effort when the temple has already selected its preferred vessel. The implications were staggering, Khentiamentiu thought, as he absorbed this information. Userhet was not merely trying to build a better barge, he was trying to preempt the entire field, to position himself as the exclusive provider of ceremonial vessels to the most powerful religious institution in Egypt. And if he succeeded, then Khentiamentiu's barge would indeed be redundant, a masterpiece with no purpose, beautiful but useless, like a perfectly crafted sword that arrived at the battlefield after the war had already been won, and all the silver he had borrowed, all the effort and skill poured into the project, all the dreams of establishing his reputation as the greatest shipwright in Egypt, all of it would be for nothing, worse than nothing, because he would be left with crushing debts and a failed project that would mark him as a man who had reached beyond his grasp and fallen. 2 months, Khentiamentiu said, thinking aloud, that gives us some time, but not much. Our barge is perhaps halfway complete. The hull is taking shape, but the interior work has barely begun. And that is where the most intricate and time-consuming craftsmanship is required. The carving, the inlay work, the painting, all the details that will make the difference between a competent vessel and a true masterpiece. We would need to work day and night to complete everything in time to present our barge before Userhet makes his presentation. And even then there is no guarantee that we could arrange an audience with the high priest. Userhet has connections in the temple hierarchy that I lack. He has been cultivating those relationships for years, precisely for opportunities like this. Kawit leaned forward, her expression intense. There may be another way, she said. I have been thinking about this, about how you could gain an advantage despite Userhet's head start and his political connections. And it seems to me that the key is not to compete on his terms, but to change the terms of the competition entirely. Userhet is positioning his barge as a replacement for the existing ceremonial vessels, an improvement on tradition. But what if your barge was presented not as a replacement, but as something entirely new, a vessel designed for a specific purpose that no existing barge serves? Then you would not be competing directly with Userhet, you would be offering something complementary, and the temple might accept both barges for different purposes. Or better yet, they might find your unique offering more valuable precisely because it fills a need rather than merely duplicating existing capabilities. It was an interesting idea, Khentiamentiu had to admit, but it raised the question of what unique purpose his barge could serve that would justify its existence independently of whatever Userhet was proposing. What specific purpose did you have in mind? He asked, curious to hear what this clever young woman had conceived, for she clearly had been thinking deeply about the strategic dimensions of the situation, rather than merely gathering information as he had requested. The royal burial ship, Kawit said, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Pharaoh is not young. Everyone knows this, and when he passes into the afterlife, he will need a vessel to carry him on his final journey, a ship that will be buried with him in his tomb. loaded with provisions and treasures for the afterlife. And this ship must be the finest ever created, worthy of a divine king. It cannot be some ordinary barge hastily repurposed for funerary use. It must be designed from the beginning, with this sacred purpose in mind, incorporating all the appropriate symbolism and religious iconography. And who better to build such a vessel than a shipwright who has dedicated himself to creating the most perfect barge possible, using only the finest materials and the most skilled craftsmanship, working not for profit but out of devotion to the gods and to Egypt itself. The audacity of the idea took Khentiamentu's breath away. To propose building Pharaoh's burial ship was to thrust himself into the highest levels of royal and religious politics, to claim a role that would normally be reserved for only the most established and well-connected craftsmen, men who had spent decades proving their loyalty and ability. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Coward was right. His barge was already designed with a kind of sacred symbolism and attention to detail that would be appropriate for a royal burial ship, the falcon imagery connecting it to Horus, and thus to the divine kingship, the celestial decorations in the cabin evoking the journey through the heavens that the dead pharaoh would undertake, the use of imperishable materials like cedar and gold that would last for eternity in the sealed environment of a tomb. All of these elements were already part of his design, and with some modifications and additions, the barge could be transformed into the perfect vessel for Pharaoh's final voyage. But how would I even propose such a thing? Khentiamentu asked, the practical difficulties looming large in his mind. I cannot simply send a message to the palace saying I have decided to build Pharaoh's burial ship. Such presumption would be seen as insulting, possibly even treasonous. There are protocols and hierarchies, channels through which such proposals must flow, and I do not have access to those channels. I am a shipwright, not a courtier. My world is wood and water, not the intricacies of royal politics. Kawit smiled, the expression of someone who had already thought through these objections and had answers prepared. You have more connections than you realize, she said. Think about who your clients have been over the years. The merchants and nobles for whom you have built boats. Some of them have influence in the court, and more importantly, some of them owe you favors. Times when you completed their vessels ahead of schedule or repaired damage at reduced cost. Times when you went beyond what your contract required because it was the right thing to do. Those gestures of goodwill have accumulated like deposits in a bank. And now is the time to withdraw that accumulated credit and put it to use. I can help you identify which of your former clients are best positioned to introduce your proposal through the proper channels, and I can help you craft the proposal itself, ensuring that it emphasizes the religious and symbolic aspects rather than merely the technical craftsmanship, because that is what will appeal to the priests and officials who advise Pharaoh on such matters. They talked late into the night, developing a strategy that was audacious but not impossible, that required luck and skill in equal measure, but which offered a path forward when all other paths seemed blocked. And as Khentiamentu finally walked back to his workshop through the dark streets of Thebes, he felt something he had not felt in weeks, a sense of hope, not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at reeds, but the solid hope of a craftsman who has found the right tool for a difficult job and knows that with patience and skill the work can be accomplished. The next morning he called a meeting of his workers, the handful of craftsmen who had remained loyal despite Userhet's enticements and the workshop's troubles, men who believed in the project and in Khentiamentu's vision, even when doing so required them to accept uncertainty and risk. And he explained to them the new direction the project would take, how they would be building not merely a ceremonial barge, but potentially the vessel that would carry Pharaoh himself into eternity. And he saw in their faces the same mix of awe and determination that he felt in his own heart. For this was the kind of commission that came once in a lifetime, if at all. The kind of work that would be remembered and honored for thousands of years, that would make their names immortal even if those names were never written in official records, because the craftsmen who built the royal burial ships were part of a sacred tradition that stretched back to the first dynasties, and their work would speak for them long after they themselves had joined the ancestors in the afterlife. Neferu, practical as always, raised the question that everyone was thinking. If we are building a burial ship for Pharaoh, then the standards become even higher than what we were already attempting. Every detail must be not just excellent, but absolutely perfect. Because this vessel will be examined by the most knowledgeable priests and officials in Egypt, men who understand symbolism and religious requirements, men who will notice if we get even the smallest detail wrong. And furthermore, we will need materials and components that we had not originally planned for. Canopic jars, shabtai figures, religious texts inscribed on the interior surfaces, all the laments that are required for a proper burial ship. Do we have the expertise to create these things? Or will we need to bring in specialists? And if so, how will we pay for them when our resources are already stretched to the breaking point? These were valid concerns, Khentiamentiu acknowledged, and they would need to be addressed systematically. We will focus first on the ship itself, on ensuring that the basic structure and craftsmanship are beyond reproach, because that is where our expertise lies, and where we can create something truly exceptional. For the specialized religious elements, we will indeed need to bring in experts. A priest who can advise on the proper texts and symbolism. Perhaps an artist who specializes in funerary decorations. But we will approach these specialists not as hired labor, but as partners in a sacred project, offering them the opportunity to contribute to something significant, rather than merely paying them for their services. And I believe that many skilled artisans will be willing to participate in such a project even if the immediate financial compensation is limited, because the honor of contributing to Pharaoh's burial ship is worth more than silver. It is a form of immortality, a way of ensuring that their work will be preserved and venerated for as long as Egypt endures. Over the following weeks, the workshop transformed into a hive of focused activity. The craftsmen working from dawn until well after dark, shaping cedar planks and fitting them together with obsessive attention to detail. And Khentiamentiu found himself sleeping in the workshop more often than in his own house, unwilling to waste time on the walk back and forth when every hour was precious, and he drove himself and his workers hard. But not cruelly, for he understood that craftsmanship could not be forced, that tired hands made mistakes and exhausted minds missed details, so he ensured that everyone ate well and rested when necessary, maintaining a pace that was sustainable even as it was demanding, finding the balance between urgency and quality that separated a successful workshop from one that burned out its workers and produced inferior results. During this period, Khawat proved invaluable, not only helping to craft the formal proposal that would be presented to the palace, but also managing the delicate negotiations with potential sponsors and supporters. She identified 3 of Khentiamentiu's former clients who had connections to the court, a merchant who supplied grain to the royal granaries and who had personal relationships with several high officials, a noble whose cousin served as a priest in the temple of Amun-Ra, and a military officer who had once commanded Pharaoh's personal guard and who still had the ear of the king on matters relating to honor and tradition. And she arranged meetings with each of these men, coaching Khentiamentiu on how to present his proposal in terms that would appeal to their particular interests and concerns, how to emphasize different aspects, depending on whether he was speaking to someone who cared about religious propriety, political advantage, or personal glory. The meetings were grueling in their own way, requiring Khentiamentiu to suppress his natural directness and instead engage in the elaborate social rituals that characterized interactions among the elite, praising his interlocutor's wisdom and generosity, framing his requests in terms of opportunities they were offering him rather than favors he was seeking, all the verbal dancing that he found tedious and somewhat dishonest, but which Khawat assured him was absolutely necessary if he wanted to succeed in this rarefied world, where words mattered as much as deeds, and where the appearance of things often trumped their reality. But gradually, through persistence and Khawat's skillful guidance, he began to secure the support he needed. Each of the 3 men agreeing to use their influence to ensure that his proposal would at least receive serious consideration from the appropriate officials, which was all he could reasonably hope for, because the final decision would rest with Pharaoh and his closest advisors, and no amount of political maneuvering could guarantee a favorable outcome when dealing with the inscrutable will of the divine king. While Khentiamentiu navigated these political waters, An unexpected complication arose in the form of Danel, the Phoenician trader who had been supplying the cedar, for Danel sent a message warning that Userhet had somehow learned about their arrangement and had confronted him during his most recent visit to Thebes, threatening to have him barred from all Egyptian ports if he continued to supply Khentiamentu with timber. And Danel, despite his earlier bravado about not being intimidated by Userhet's tactics, was now reconsidering whether the risk was worth the reward, especially since other traders had warned him that Userhet's threats were not empty, that he had indeed used his influence to destroy the Egyptian business of merchants who had crossed him, and Danel had a family to support and a trading business that depended on access to Egyptian markets, and he could not afford to sacrifice all of that for the sake of one client, no matter how much he personally sympathized with Khentiamentu's situation. The news hit Khentiamentu like a physical blow, for he had already used most of the cedar from the first shipment, and he needed at least one more delivery, possibly two, to complete the burial ship. The hull was nearly finished, but the interior cabin and the decorative elements still required substantial quantities of the precious wood, and if Danel cut off the supply, Khentiamentu would be forced to seek alternative sources, a process that could take weeks or months, and which would almost certainly mean missing the critical window before Userhet presented his own barge to the high priest. But more than the practical implications, the betrayal stung, for he had trusted Danel, had believed that their agreement was based on mutual respect and shared values, that the young Phoenician trader was different from the mercenaries who would sell out anyone for sufficient silver. And now it seemed that Danel was just as calculating and self-interested as all the others, willing to abandon his commitments when the pressure mounted. In his anger and disappointment, Khentiamentu's first impulse was to write an accusatory letter to Danel, reminding him of his promises and calling into question his honor and integrity. But Kawit, when he consulted her, advised a different approach. Anger is understandable, but not strategic, she said, with the calm rationality that characterized her thinking. Danel is not betraying you out of malice, but out of fear. Fear for his livelihood and his family's welfare. And that fear is based on a realistic assessment of Userhet's power and willingness to use it. So if you want to change Danel's decision, you need to address that fear. You need to give him a reason to believe that continuing to supply you with cedar will not result in the disaster that Userhet has threatened. And the way to do that is to demonstrate that you have powerful allies of your own, that you are not some isolated craftsman who can be crushed with impunity, but rather someone who is connected and protected, someone whose enemies will face consequences of their own. Following Kawit's advice, Khentiamentu arranged for the military officer who had agreed to support his proposal, a stern man named Horemheb who had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades in the sun, commanding troops to accompany him on a visit to Danel's warehouse in Memphis. And Horemheb's presence, with his obvious military bearing and the deference he commanded from everyone they encountered, sent a clear message that Khentiamentu was not without influential friends. And when they met with Danel and Khentiamentu, calmly explained that he understood the trader's concerns, but that he could provide assurances that Userhet's threats were exaggerated, that there were people in positions of authority who took a dim view of merchants, who used intimidation tactics, and who would be very interested to learn about specific instances of such behavior. The young Phoenician's attitude shifted noticeably, his fear giving way to calculation, reassessing the risks and rewards in light of this new information. And by the end of the meeting, he had agreed to resume the cedar shipments, though he requested additional payment to compensate for the increased risk, a demand that Khentiamentu accepted with barely concealed relief, for silver could always be found or borrowed, but time was a resource that, once spent, could never be recovered. With the cedar supply secured, at least temporarily, Khentiamentu returned to Thebes and threw himself back into the work, and now the burial ship began to truly take shape, the graceful curves of the hull rising like a bird preparing for flight, the cabin emerging with its intricate decorations, every surface carved or painted with religious texts and protective symbols, the 42 gods of the Tribunal of the Dead represented in miniature along the interior walls, each one rendered with careful attention to traditional iconography. For any deviation from established religious conventions could be seen as sacrilege and would doom the entire project. and Khentiamentiu spent hours consulting with the priest he had enlisted, an elderly man named Amenhotep who had served in the mortuary temple of Thutmose III and who knew the funerary texts and rituals with encyclopedic thoroughness, and together they ensured that every symbol, every hieroglyph, every decorative element carried the correct meaning and contributed to the overall purpose of preparing a sacred vessel to carry Pharaoh through the dangers of the underworld and into the blessed fields of the afterlife. The work on the burial ship consumed Khentiamentiu utterly, becoming not merely a project but an obsession that defined every waking moment and invaded his dreams. He would wake in the middle of the night with sudden insights about how a particular joint should be fitted or how a decorative element could be improved. And he would rush to the workshop to sketch his ideas or to make adjustments to the plans, and his workers, seeing their master's absolute dedication, responded with their own heightened commitment, for there was something infectious about working on a project that mattered so profoundly, that connected them to forces and purposes larger than their individual lives, and the workshop took on an almost sacred atmosphere. The men speaking in hushed voices when discussing the work, treating each piece of cedar with reverence, understanding that they were not merely building a boat, but creating a vessel that would carry a god-king into eternity. And that responsibility weighed on them even as it elevated them, making them feel simultaneously humbled and honored. As the weeks passed and the festival of Opet drew closer, the rivalry with Userhet intensified in ways both obvious and subtle. Khentiamentiu noticed that some of his suppliers began experiencing unusual delays in their deliveries. Shipments of rope and resin and other materials that should have arrived on schedule were held up by various bureaucratic complications, inspections that took longer than usual, permits that required additional approvals, all the grinding machinery of official obstruction that could make simple transactions into nightmares of delay and frustration. And it was clear that Userhet was using every connection and every lever of power available to him to slow down Khentiamentiu's progress, hoping that even if he could not stop the burial ship project entirely, he could at least ensure that it would not be completed in time to interfere with his own presentation to the high priest. But Userhet's campaign of interference had an unintended consequence, for it attracted the attention of people who were growing concerned about the concentration of power and influence in the hands of a single shipwright. Merchants who worried that if Userhet succeeded in monopolizing the ceremonial vessel market, he would be able to dictate terms to everyone else, charging exorbitant prices and providing inferior service because customers would have no alternatives, and officials who disliked the way Userhet seemed to think that rules and regulations applied to everyone except himself, that his connections gave him immunity from the standards that governed ordinary craftsmen, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a coalition began to form in opposition to Userhet. Not organized or formal, but rather a loose alignment of interests, people who for various reasons wanted to see him brought down or at least checked, and Khentiamentiu found himself receiving unexpected assistance from quarters he had not anticipated. A harbor master who expedited the clearance of his material shipments, a guild official who quietly warned him about upcoming inspections, small acts of support that individually meant little, but which collectively helped to offset some of Userhet's advantages. Meanwhile, Cowit continued her work as a scribe in Userhet's workshop, feeding Khentiamentiu regular updates about his rival's progress, and what she reported was both impressive and worrying. For Userhet's barge was indeed magnificent. The craftsmanship was excellent, even if it lacked the mathematical precision and subtle elegance of Khentiamentiu's work, and Userhet had spared no expense in the decorative elements, employing some of the finest artists in Thebes to create elaborate paintings and carvings that covered nearly every surface of the vessel. The overall effect was one of overwhelming richness, a display of wealth and power that would certainly impress anyone who valued ostentation and grandeur, and Cowit reported that Userhet was supremely confident about the upcoming presentation, convinced that the high priest would be so awed by the barge that approval would be immediate and enthusiastic, and that confidence was not entirely misplaced. For Userhet had cultivated his relationship with the temple hierarchy carefully over many years, making generous donations and ensuring that his name was associated with piety and devotion to the gods, building a reservoir of goodwill that he was now preparing to draw upon. The question that haunted Khentiamentu as he worked was whether his own barge, designed for a different purpose and presented through less established channels, would be able to compete with Userhet's offering, whether the religious and symbolic significance of a burial ship would outweigh the immediate practical appeal of a replacement for the aging ceremonial barges used in temple festivals. And he had no answer, no certainty. Only faith that quality would ultimately be recognized and rewarded, that the gods who supposedly governed the universe with perfect justice would ensure that the better work, the more honest effort, would triumph over mere political maneuvering and superficial display, though he knew that such faith was perhaps naive, that the world often rewarded the cunning and the well-connected rather than the skilled and the virtuous. But without that faith he could not continue, could not justify the sacrifices he had made and was asking others to make. And so he clung to it like a man adrift on the Nile clung to a piece of driftwood, knowing it might not be enough to save him, but having no other option. 3 weeks before the festival of Opet, disaster struck in a form that Khentiamentu had not anticipated and could not have prevented. A fire broke out in the section of his workshop where the finished planks were stored, the cedar that had already been shaped and prepared for final assembly. And though the fire was discovered quickly and extinguished before it could spread to the rest of the building, the damage was substantial. Nearly a third of the prepared lumber was either destroyed or damaged beyond use, charred and cracked and rendered useless for the precision work required in building the burial ship. And the loss was not merely material, but temporal, for replacing those planks would require weeks of work, time that simply did not exist if the ship was to be completed before Userhet made his presentation. The cause of the fire was never definitively established. The night watchman reported that he had seen nothing suspicious, no intruders or unusual activity, and it was possible that the fire had started naturally. A lamp knocked over by a cat or a spark from the metalworking area that had smoldered unnoticed until it found fuel in the stacks of cedar. But Khentiamentu could not shake the suspicion that this was not an accident, but sabotage, another of Userhet's attacks, more direct and more damaging than anything that had come before. And the fact that he could not prove it, that he had no evidence beyond his gut feeling and his knowledge of his rival's character, made the suspicion even more corrosive, feeding his anger and his sense of helplessness in equal measure. Neferu, surveying the damage in the gray light of early morning, the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, and the charred timbers looking like the bones of some great beast that had been consumed by fire, expressed the thought that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. "We cannot complete the ship in time," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Even if we work day and night without rest, even if we somehow find replacement cedar immediately. There is simply not enough time to shape the planks and fit them and complete all the finishing work that remains. We are defeated, not by lack of skill or will, but by the calendar, by the inexorable passage of time that no craftsman can overcome, no matter how dedicated or talented he might be." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Khentiamentu felt something inside him rebel against their finality, against the idea that all his efforts and dreams should come to nothing because of one disaster, whether accidental or deliberate. "No," he said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "We are not defeated. Not yet. There must be a way. We will find a way. I did not come this far and sacrifice this much to surrender when the goal is in sight. Even if we cannot complete the ship exactly as planned, we can complete enough of it to demonstrate its potential, to show what it will become when finished. And sometimes potential is more valuable than completion. Sometimes the vision of what could be is more powerful than the reality of what is, because vision invites imagination and participation in a way that finished products do not." It was a desperate argument, he knew, born more from refusal to accept defeat than from rational analysis. But as he spoke the words, he began to believe them, to see a path forward that was not ideal but which might be sufficient. They could focus their remaining time and resources on completing the hull and the most visible and impressive elements of the decoration, ensuring that those parts were absolutely perfect, while leaving some of the interior work unfinished, but clearly roughed in, showing enough that knowledgeable observers could extrapolate what the final result would be, and they could present the ship not as a completed artifact ready for immediate use, but as a work in progress, a demonstration of capabilities and intentions. With a timeline for completion that extended beyond the Festival of Opet, this approach would require them to be transparent about the setback they had suffered, to acknowledge the fire and its impact on their schedule, but honesty might actually work in their favor, might generate sympathy and admiration for their perseverance in the face of adversity, and might also subtly raise questions about whether the fire had been entirely accidental, planting seeds of doubt about Userhet's methods without making direct accusations that could not be proven. The workers, hearing Khentiamentu's refusal to surrender, rallied with renewed energy, and the workshop became a scene of almost frantic activity, everyone understanding that every hour mattered, that there was no margin for error or inefficiency, and they developed a rhythm that was almost musical, the sound of saws and hammers, chisels and sanders blending into a symphony of creation. And Khentiamentu worked alongside them, his hands blistered and his back aching, but his spirit somehow undimmed, finding in the physical labor a kind of meditation, a way of focusing his mind and channeling his anxiety into productive effort. And he remembered something his father had told him long ago, that the mark of a true craftsman was not the ability to work under ideal conditions, but the ability to adapt and overcome when conditions were difficult, to find solutions when problems seemed insurmountable, to create beauty and quality even when circumstances conspired against such achievement. During this intense period of work, Khentiamentu received an unexpected visit from Horemheb, the military officer who had agreed to support his proposal for the burial ship, and Horemheb brought news that was both encouraging and complicated. "I have been making inquiries on your behalf," the old soldier said, his scarred face serious, "speaking to people I know in the palace, and I have learned that there is indeed interest in commissioning a new burial ship for Pharaoh. The current one was built during the reign of his predecessor, and there is a feeling that it does not adequately reflect the glory and power of the current dynasty, so the timing of your proposal is excellent. You are offering something that is wanted even if it has not been officially requested. But there is a complication. The official you need to convince is the overseer of the treasury, a man named Ptahhotep, who is responsible for all major expenditures, including those related to Pharaoh's eventual burial and the preparation of his tomb. And Ptahhotep is known to be extremely conservative in his spending. He approves nothing that is not absolutely necessary, and he questions every cost, demanding detailed justifications for even the smallest expenses. And furthermore, I have learned that Userhet has been cultivating a relationship with Ptahhotep's chief scribe, providing him with gifts and favors, almost certainly with the intention of influencing any decisions related to ceremonial vessels. This news added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation, Khentiamentu thought, for it meant that even if his burial ship was technically superior to Userhet's barge, even if it better served its intended purpose, he might still lose the commission if he could not convince a cost-conscious official that the expense was justified. And that would require him to frame his proposal not merely in terms of quality and religious appropriateness, but in terms of practical value, demonstrating that a properly designed burial ship would actually save money in the long run because it would not need to be replaced or extensively modified, that investing in excellence now would prevent the need for costly repairs and adjustments later. All the economic arguments that were antithetical to the spiritual and aesthetic values that had motivated him to undertake the project in the first place, but which he would need to master if he wanted to succeed in the bureaucratic environment of the royal court. Horemheb, seeing Khentiamentu's consternation, offered some tactical advice. Ptahhotep is not a bad man, merely a careful one. He takes his responsibilities seriously, and he genuinely tries to protect the treasury from waste and fraud, which means he is actually more susceptible to honest arguments than to the kind of manipulation that Userhet favors. If you can present your case clearly and support it with solid reasoning, if you can show him that you are not trying to enrich yourself at the expense of the state, but rather offering a genuine service at a fair price, then he will give you a fair hearing, And unlike many officials, he cannot be easily swayed by political pressure or personal connections. He prides himself on making decisions based on merit rather than favoritism, which is why he has survived and prospered through multiple changes in administration, serving different pharaohs and different viziers without losing his position, because everyone recognizes that he is incorruptible and competent, two qualities that are rarer in government than one might hope. The characterization of Ptahhotep actually gave Khentiamentu some hope, for if the overseer of the treasury truly valued merit and honest dealing, then Khentiamentu's chances might be better than he had feared. His approach had always been straightforward, letting his work speak for itself. And if that approach would actually be an advantage rather than a liability in this context, then perhaps the gods were not entirely against him. Perhaps there was still a path to success that did not require him to become someone he was not, to adopt the dishonest tactics that he had always despised in others. With Horemheb's guidance, Khentiamentu began preparing a detailed proposal for Ptahhotep, a document that would lay out not only the design and specifications of the burial ship, but also a complete accounting of costs, a timeline for completion, and an explanation of why this particular design was superior to alternatives. And he enlisted Cowet's help in drafting the document, for she had experience in writing the kind of formal bureaucratic language that officials expected, and together they worked late into the night, revising and refining the proposal, ensuring that every claim was supported by evidence, every cost justified by necessity, every design choice explained in terms that a non-specialist could understand and appreciate. And gradually, the document took shape, becoming a compelling argument for why the burial ship project deserved royal support, why it represented not extravagance, but prudent investment in a sacred duty that the state owed to its divine ruler. Why? Khentiamentu was preparing his proposal. Userhet was making his own preparations for the presentation to the high priest, and the entire city of Thebes seemed to buzz with anticipation. For word had spread about the rivalry between the two shipwrights, and about the magnificent vessels they were creating. And people speculated endlessly about which barge would be superior, taking sides based on their relationships with the two men, or their assessment of their respective reputations. And this public attention added another dimension of pressure to what was already an enormously stressful situation. For now, it was not merely a matter of winning a commission or achieving a personal dream, but of public vindication or public humiliation. Everyone in Thebes would know whether Khentiamentu succeeded or failed, and that knowledge would shape his reputation and his future prospects for years to come. The night before Userhet's scheduled presentation to the high priest, Khentiamentu stood alone in his workshop, looking at the burial ship that was still not quite finished. The hull was complete and magnificent. The cedar planks fitted together with such precision that the seams were almost invisible. The exterior coated with resin and gold leaf that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with inner fire. The falcon-headed prow rising proudly, a declaration of divine protection and royal authority, but the interior, though roughed in and clearly showing the intended design, still lacked many of the finishing touches that would transform it from an impressive structure into a true masterpiece. And he felt a complex mixture of pride and frustration, satisfaction with what had been accomplished, but awareness of what remained undone, and he wondered if it would be enough, if the vision he had pursued with such single-minded intensity would be recognized and valued, or if he had simply been chasing a dream that was always meant to remain just beyond his grasp. He thought about his father, about what Okhmos would have thought of this project, and the risks Khentiamentu had taken to pursue it. His father had been a conservative man in many ways, believing in steady progress rather than dramatic leaps, in building a reputation slowly through consistent quality rather than gambling everything on a single spectacular achievement. And Khentiamentu knew that his father would have been troubled by the debts he had accumulated, the political maneuvering he had engaged in, the way he had pushed his workers and himself to the edge of exhaustion, all in service of a vision that might ultimately prove to be unsustainable. But he also believed that his father would have understood, would have recognized in his son's obsession an echo of his own passion for the craft, the desire to create something that transcended mere utility and approached the realm of art, the need to leave a mark on the world that would outlast the brief span of mortal life, and he hoped that wherever his father's spirit resided, in the afterlife or in the memory of those who had known him, there would be pride alongside the concern, appreciation for the ambition even if the outcome remained uncertain. The next day, as Userhet prepared to unveil his ceremonial barge to the high priest of Amun-Ra and to the assembled dignitaries who had been invited to witness the presentation, Khenti-Amentiu remained in his workshop, refusing to attend what he knew would be a carefully staged spectacle designed to maximize Userhet's advantage. Instead, he worked on the burial ship, making final adjustments to the decorative elements, polishing surfaces until they gleamed, ensuring that every visible detail was perfect, for he knew that his own opportunity would come soon. Horemheb had arranged for him to present his proposal to Ptahhotep within the week, and he needed to be ready, needed to have the burial ship in the best possible condition given the time and resources available, and he tried not to think about what was happening at Userhet's workshop, tried not to imagine the reactions of the high priest and the other officials as they saw his rival's creation for the first time, tried not to calculate how Userhet's success would impact his own chances, but of course he could think of nothing else. His hands worked automatically, following patterns so deeply ingrained that they required no conscious thought, while his mind churned with anxiety and speculation, playing out scenarios of triumph and disaster in equal measure. News of Userhet's presentation reached Khenti-Amentiu that evening, brought by one of his workers who had a cousin among the servants at the temple, and the report was both expected and devastating. The high priest had been deeply impressed by Userhet's barge, praising its magnificence and declaring that it would be a worthy addition to the temple's ceremonial fleet. He had not made a final commitment, for such decisions required consultation with other temple officials and could not be made impulsively even by someone of the high priest's authority, but the enthusiasm of his initial reaction left little doubt about which way his eventual decision would lean, and Userhet had apparently been magnanimous in his moment of triumph, thanking everyone profusely and promising that his workshop would continue to serve the temple with dedication and skill, cementing his position as the favored craftsman for all future ceremonial vessels. And there had been no mention of Khenti-Amentiu or of any competing proposals. Userhet had effectively owned the entire conversation, defining the terms and setting the standard against which any alternatives would be judged. The morning of Khenti-Amentiu's presentation to Ptahhotep arrived with a sky the color of brass, the sun rising through a haze of dust that had blown in from the desert during the night. And Khenti-Amentiu woke early after a restless sleep filled with anxious dreams. He dressed in his finest linen kilt and a new tunic that Kawit had insisted he purchase for the occasion. For appearances mattered in the world of palace officials, even if such superficial concerns seemed irrelevant to someone whose life had been spent working with his hands and judging things by their substance rather than their surface. And he spent extra time ensuring that his hands were clean, that no trace of resin or sawdust remained under his fingernails, trying to transform himself from a craftsman into something more refined, more suitable for the audience he was about to face, though he knew that no amount of grooming could fully disguise what he was, and perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps Ptahhotep would appreciate dealing with someone who was genuinely what he appeared to be, rather than another courtier skilled in pretense and political calculation. Kawit arrived at his house just as he was finishing his preparations, carrying the carefully prepared proposal document rolled and sealed with wax, and she looked him over with a critical eye, adjusting the drape of his tunic and offering last-minute advice about how to conduct himself in the presence of a high official. "Remember that Ptahhotep values precision and clarity," she said. "Do not exaggerate or make claims you cannot support. Answer his questions directly without trying to evade or obscure. And most importantly, do not let him bait you into criticizing Userhet. He may ask you about your rival's work or about the competition between you. But if you respond by attacking Userhet, you will seem petty and envious. Instead, focus on the unique merits of your own proposal, on what makes the burial ship valuable. Independent of any comparison to other vessels, let your work speak for itself, and trust that Ptahhotep is intelligent enough to recognize quality when he sees it." They traveled together to the administrative complex where Ptahhotep maintained his offices, a sprawling building near the palace that housed the various bureaucracies responsible for managing the kingdom's finances. and as they approached through courtyards filled with scribes and petitioners, all waiting for audiences with various officials, Khentiamentiu felt his nervousness increasing, the sense that he was entering a world where the rules were different from those he understood, where success depended not on skill and craftsmanship, but on verbal dexterity and political acumen, qualities he possessed in limited measure. But Kawit's presence beside him provided some reassurance, her calm competence and her familiarity with bureaucratic procedures helping to ground him, reminding him that he was not entirely out of his depth, that he had allies and resources even in this alien environment. Ptahhotep's office was surprisingly modest, considering the importance of his position. A room furnished with simple elegance rather than ostentatious display, papyrus scrolls lined the walls in neat rows, records of accounts and expenditures stretching back decades, a physical manifestation of the meticulous attention to detail that characterized the overseer of the treasury's approach to his duties, and Ptahhotep himself, when he emerged from an inner chamber to greet his visitors, matched the room in his understated appearance. A man of perhaps 50 years with intelligent eyes and the erect posture of someone who took pride in his work without needing external validation. He wore the simple kilt and collar of an official, but without the elaborate jewelry and decorations that many of his rank affected, and his greeting was courteous but reserved, acknowledging Khentiamentiu and Kawit with a nod, and gesturing for them to be seated on stools that had been placed before a low table where the proposal document would be examined. "I have heard of your project," Ptahhotep began without preamble, getting directly to business in a way that Khentiamentiu appreciated. "Horemheb spoke to me about your proposal to build a burial ship for Pharaoh. And I will be frank with you, my initial reaction was skepticism. We have not solicited such a proposal, and there are established procedures for commissioning royal funerary equipment. Procedures that exist for good reasons, to ensure quality and to prevent waste. But Horemheb is a man whose judgment I respect, and he seemed to think that your proposal merited serious consideration, so I agreed to this meeting. But I will need to be convinced that this project is necessary, and that you are the right person to execute it. The treasury is not an inexhaustible resource, despite what some people seem to think, and every deben of silver spent on one project is silver that cannot be spent on something else. Roads, temples, military equipment, all the many needs of the kingdom. So you must demonstrate not merely that your burial ship would be nice to have, but that it would be essential, that it would serve purposes that cannot be served by existing resources, or by less expensive alternatives. Khentiamentiu had expected this kind of challenge and had prepared for it, drawing on the arguments he and Kawit had developed over many late-night discussions. "Overseer, I understand your concerns about the treasury, and I appreciate your willingness to hear my proposal, despite your initial skepticism," he began, keeping his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Let me start by explaining why a new burial ship is necessary, rather than merely desirable. The current royal burial ship, as you know, was commissioned during the previous reign, and while it was adequate for its time, it does not reflect the achievements and the glory of the current dynasty. Pharaoh has expanded Egypt's influence, strengthened its borders, enriched its temples, and when he eventually passes into the afterlife, his burial should reflect these accomplishments, should demonstrate to the gods and to future generations that he was a ruler of exceptional capability and vision, and the vessel that carries him on his final journey is a crucial element of that demonstration. It is not merely a boat, but a statement, a declaration of who Pharaoh was and what he represented, and if that vessel is inadequate or outdated, it diminishes the entire ceremony. It suggests that even in death, the greatest king in the world could not command resources appropriate to his station. Ptahhotep listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, but his attention clearly engaged. And when Khentiamentiu paused, the overseer asked a pointed question. "What you say about symbolism and representation is all very well, but could not the existing burial ship be refurbished and updated, decorated with new carvings and paintings that reflect the current reign, at far less expense than building an entirely new vessel? Why is replacement necessary when renovation might suffice?" It was exactly the kind of hard-headed practical question that Kawit had predicted, and Khentiamentiu had an answer ready. That, is a reasonable question, Overseer. And if we were discussing an ordinary vessel, then renovation might indeed be the preferable option. But burial ships have specific structural requirements that go beyond surface decoration. They must be constructed from imperishable materials like cedar, rather than the acacia that was used in the previous ship. They must incorporate religious symbolism, not just in their decorative elements, but in their fundamental design. The proportions, the orientation, the integration of sacred texts into the very structure of the vessel. All of these elements need to be conceived as a unified whole from the beginning. You cannot simply add them to an existing ship and expect the same effect. It would be like trying to transform a house into a temple by painting religious scenes on the walls. The surface might look appropriate, but the underlying structure would still be wrong. And for something as important as Pharaoh's journey through the afterlife, we cannot accept something that merely looks right. It must be right, in every particular, because the gods will see through superficial modifications and judge the offering based on its true nature. Ptahhotep nodded slowly, seeming to appreciate the theological argument, even if he remained unconvinced about the practical necessity. And you believe you can build this ideal burial ship. You have the skills and the resources and the understanding of religious requirements necessary to create something that meets these exacting standards. Forgive my bluntness, but you are a shipwright, not a priest. How can you be certain that what you create will be religiously appropriate, that it will satisfy the complex requirements of funerary ritual and theology? Khenti had anticipated this question as well, and he gestured to the proposal document on the table. I have been working closely with a priest named Amenhotep, who served for many years in the mortuary temple of Thutmosis III, and who is considered one of the foremost experts on funerary practices and religious symbolism. He has reviewed every aspect of my design and has made numerous suggestions and corrections, ensuring that the burial ship incorporates all the appropriate elements: the texts from the Book of the Dead, the protective symbols, the representations of the gods who guard the passages through the underworld, all rendered in accordance with traditional iconography and positioned in the correct relationships to each other. And furthermore, the proposal document includes letters from Amenhotep attesting to the religious correctness of the design. You will see that he has given his complete endorsement, stating that, in his professional opinion, this burial ship would be superior to any previous royal funerary vessel in its attention to theological detail and its integration of spiritual requirements into the physical structure. This seemed to make an impression on Ptahhotep, for he reached for the proposal document and began unrolling it, his eyes scanning the carefully written text and pausing on the letters of endorsement from Amenhotep and from several of Khenti's former clients who testified to his skill and reliability. And for several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustle of papyrus as the overseer examined the document page by page, occasionally asking questions about specific costs or timeline estimates. Questions that Khenti answered as precisely as possible, citing the calculations he and Neferu had made, the experience they had accumulated over years of shipbuilding, the comparisons to similar projects they had completed in the past, all the evidence that demonstrated he was not simply making optimistic guesses, but basing his estimates on solid experience and careful analysis. Finally, Ptahhotep set down the document and looked directly at Khenti, his expression still neutral but with perhaps a slight warming around the eyes. This is a thorough and well-reasoned proposal, he said, more thorough than many I receive from people with far more experience in dealing with government bureaucracies, and I am inclined to believe that you could indeed build what you promise, but there remains the question of timing and competition. I am aware that another shipwright, Userhet, has recently presented a ceremonial barge to the high priest of Amun-Ra, and while that vessel was designed for a different purpose, it demonstrates that there are other qualified craftsmen available, craftsmen who have successfully completed major projects and who have established relationships with the temple hierarchy. So I need to understand why I should commission you rather than approaching Userhet or someone else with a proven track record of delivering prestigious vessels on time and within budget. This was the moment Khenti had been dreading, the point where he would need to distinguish himself from Userhet without directly attacking his rival, and he chose his words carefully. Overseer. I cannot speak to Userhead's qualifications or capabilities, as I have not examined his work in detail. What I can tell you is what makes my approach distinctive. I have spent my entire career building vessels that prioritize structural integrity and longevity over surface appearance. My boats are known throughout Thebes for lasting decades, longer than comparable vessels built by other workshops, because I refuse to cut corners or use inferior materials, even when doing so would increase my profit margins. And this philosophy is particularly important for a burial ship, which will be sealed in a tomb and expected to remain intact for eternity. You cannot afford to have joints that weaken over time or materials that decay. Everything must be built to the highest possible standard, and while this approach is more expensive in the short term, it is actually more economical in the long run because it eliminates the need for repairs or replacements, and in the specific case of a burial ship, where there will be no opportunity for repairs once it is entombed, the quality of construction is not a luxury, but a necessity. Ptahhotep considered this argument, his fingers drumming softly on the table in a rhythm that suggested he was working through the implications. You make a compelling case for quality over economy, he said, but quality is difficult to verify in advance. I cannot know whether your vessel will truly last for eternity until eternity has passed, which is somewhat impractical as a basis for making decisions in the present. What assurance can you give me that your promises of superior craftsmanship are not merely the claims of a salesman trying to close a deal? How can I distinguish genuine quality from clever marketing? The question was fair, Khentimenetu acknowledged, and it struck at the heart of the problem he had always faced. How to demonstrate value that could only be fully appreciated over time. How to convince people to pay more for quality they could not immediately see or measure. Overseer, I can offer you the opportunity to inspect the burial ship I am currently building, he said, making a decision that he had been considering but had hesitated to commit to. It is not yet complete. We suffered a setback recently, when a fire damaged some of our prepared materials, but the hull is finished, and much of the decorative work is in place. Enough that you can evaluate the quality of the craftsmanship and the attention to detail. You can examine the joints, test the strength of the construction, consult with experts to verify that the religious symbolism is correctly implemented. And based on that inspection, you can make an informed judgment about whether my claims are justified. I would not make this offer if I were not confident in the quality of my work, because I know that close inspection will reveal flaws in anything that is built merely for appearance rather than for genuine excellence. This offer seemed to surprise Ptahhotep, and for the first time, his expression showed something other than professional neutrality. A flicker of respect for someone who was willing to let his work be judged on its merits rather than hiding behind rhetoric and promises. That is a bold offer. The overseer said, and I accept it. I will arrange to visit your workshop within the next few days, and I will bring with me people who have expertise in shipbuilding and in religious matters. People who can assess whether your burial ship meets the standards you claim. And I will tell you now that I will be looking for reasons to reject your proposal. Not because I wish you ill, but because my duty requires me to be skeptical, to protect the treasury from waste and fraud. So you should prepare yourself for a very thorough and critical examination. And if we find significant flaws or evidence that you have misrepresented your capabilities, I will not hesitate to deny your proposal, and possibly to report you to the appropriate authorities for making false claims to a government official. Khentimenetu nodded, accepting the challenge. I would expect nothing less, Overseer, and I welcome the scrutiny, because I have nothing to hide and everything to gain from an honest evaluation of my work. I will prepare my workshop for your visit, and I will make available all the documentation of our processes and materials. You will have complete transparency, and I am confident that what you see will convince you that this project deserves your support. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with Ptahhotep making no commitment beyond agreeing to the inspection. But Kawit, as they left the administrative complex and emerged into the bright sunlight of midday, seemed cautiously optimistic. That went better than I expected, she said. Ptahhotep is difficult to read, but I think he was impressed by your directness and by your willingness to let your work be inspected. Many people who come before him make grandiose promises but become evasive when asked for concrete evidence. So your offer to open your workshop to examination set you apart, made you seem more credible than the usual supplicants who want treasury support. Now we need to ensure that the inspection goes well, that every aspect of the burial ship is perfect, that there are no loose ends or questionable elements that could give Ptahhotep's experts an excuse to criticize the work. The next 2 days were a frenzy of preparation. Khentiamentu and his workers going over every inch of the burial ship, fixing minor imperfections, cleaning and polishing, organizing the workshop so that materials and tools were neatly arranged and labeled, creating an atmosphere of order and professionalism that would reinforce the impression that this was a serious and competent operation rather than the chaotic struggle that it had sometimes felt like during the most difficult periods. And Khentiamentu also spent time with Amenhotep, ensuring that the priest would be available during the inspection to answer any questions about the religious aspects of the design, to provide authoritative confirmation that the symbolism and texts were correctly implemented, for he knew that Ptahhotep would bring his own experts and that it would be valuable to have someone of Amenhotep's reputation and knowledge present to validate the work. The inspection took place on a morning that was cooler than usual, a brief respite from the relentless heat that had characterized the past weeks. And Ptahhotep arrived with a small retinue that included 2 master shipwrights from other workshops, neither of them associated with Userhet, but both known for their expertise and high standards, and a priest from the temple of Osiris, the god most closely associated with death and resurrection, whose expertise in funerary matters would be crucial in evaluating the burial ship's religious appropriateness. And the group spent nearly 4 hours examining the vessel, climbing aboard to inspect the interior, running their hands over the joints to check their tightness, questioning Khentiamentu about his choice of materials and construction techniques, discussing the religious symbolism with Amenhotep and consulting scrolls to verify that the texts and images were accurate. And throughout it all, Khentiamentu tried to remain calm and confident, answering questions honestly even when the answers revealed limitations or compromises, trusting that transparency would serve him better than attempting to hide or minimize the challenges he had faced. One of the shipwrights, a grizzled veteran named Seneb, who had built boats for the royal family in the previous reign, was particularly thorough in his examination, testing joints by trying to force them apart, examining the grain of the cedar to ensure that it had been cut properly, checking the symmetry of the hull by taking careful measurements, and at one point he turned to Khentiamentu and said, "I have been building boats for 40 years, and I have seen a lot of work that looked impressive from a distance, but fell apart under close examination. But this," he gestured to the burial ship, "this is genuine quality. These joints are as tight as any I have ever seen, tighter than most, and the selection of timber is excellent. Whoever chose these cedars knew what they were doing. This ship will still be sound 1,000 years from now if it is protected from the elements. And even if it is not protected, it will outlast anything built from acacia or sycamore by centuries. You have not exaggerated your capabilities. Shipwright, if anything, you have understated them. This is masterwork." The praise from Seneb, delivered in his characteristically blunt manner without any attempt at flattery or diplomacy, seemed to carry weight with Ptahhotep, who had been listening carefully to all the assessments offered by his experts, and the priest from the temple of Osiris was similarly positive in his evaluation of the religious elements, confirming that the texts were accurate and appropriately placed, that the symbolism was consistent with traditional funerary practices, and that the overall design showed a sophisticated understanding of the theological requirements for a vessel meant to carry a soul through the dangers of the afterlife and into the blessed realm of eternity. "This burial ship shows more attention to religious correctness than many funerary vessels I have seen," the priest said, "including some that were built for members of the royal family. Whoever designed this understood that form must follow spiritual function, that every element must contribute to the sacred purpose, and that understanding is reflected in the careful integration of protective symbols and divine representations. I would be honored to conduct the consecration ritual for such a vessel when it is completed." After the experts had finished their examination and offered their assessments, Ptahhotep walked slowly around the burial ship one more time, his expression thoughtful, And then he turned to Khentiamentu and said, "I am prepared to recommend that the Treasury provide funding for the completion of this burial ship, subject to certain conditions that we will need to negotiate. The timeline for completion, the total budget, the provisions for inspection and approval at various stages, all the bureaucratic details that are necessary to protect the interests of the state. But I want you to understand that this recommendation is not based on political considerations or personal relationships, but purely on the merit of your work and the validity of your proposal. I am convinced that you can deliver what you promise, and that the burial ship you create will serve its sacred purpose effectively, while representing a prudent use of Treasury resources. And I will be frank with you. I find it refreshing to deal with someone who relies on skill rather than connections, who lets his work speak for itself rather than trying to manipulate the system through favors and influence. If we had more craftsmen like you, and fewer like some others I could name, my job would be considerably easier, and the kingdom would be better served." The words brought a wave of relief and vindication that left Khentiamentu almost dizzy. For this was what he had been working toward through all the setbacks and struggles: official recognition that his approach was valid, that quality and integrity mattered, that he had not been foolish to pursue excellence, even when it seemed that the world rewarded other qualities. And he thanked Ptahhotep with genuine gratitude, promising that he would meet whatever conditions were required, that the Treasury's confidence would not be misplaced, that the completed burial ship would exceed even the positive expectations that the inspection had generated. And Ptahhotep, allowing himself a small smile, replied that he looked forward to seeing the finished vessel, and that he hoped it would set a new standard for royal funerary equipment that would influence craftsmen for generations to come. News of Ptahhotep's endorsement spread through Thebes with remarkable speed, carried by the workers who had witnessed the inspection and by the officials who had accompanied the overseer of the treasury. And within days it seemed that everyone in the city knew that Khentiamentu had secured royal backing for his burial ship project, that he had won approval through the quality of his work rather than through political maneuvering. And the reaction was mixed. Those who had supported him from the beginning felt vindicated in their faith, celebrating his success as evidence that merit still mattered in a world that often seemed dominated by corruption and favoritism, while those who had aligned themselves with Userhet or who simply disliked seeing an outsider succeed felt resentful, muttering that Khentiamentu had gotten lucky, that Ptahhotep must have been deceived somehow, that the approval would surely be reversed once certain people became aware of it and took appropriate action. But regardless of how people interpreted the news, everyone agreed that the rivalry between Khentiamentu and Userhet had entered a new and more intense phase, that what had begun as competition between two shipwrights had become something larger, a test of competing philosophies about how business should be conducted and success achieved. Userhet's reaction to the news was swift and characteristically aggressive. He began spreading rumors that Khentiamentu's burial ship was structurally unsound, that the cedar had been improperly seasoned and would warp and crack within years, that the religio, that symbolism was incorrect and would offend the gods rather than honoring them. And he suggested darkly that Ptahhotep had been influenced by bribes or personal relationships, that the overseer's famous incorruptibility was merely a facade that concealed the same venality that characterized all government officials. And these rumors, though entirely fabricated, found receptive audiences among those who were predisposed to believe the worst, who enjoyed scandal and intrigue more than they valued truth. And Khentiamentu found himself having to defend his reputation and his work against accusations that were impossible to disprove completely because they were so vague and unspecific. How could he demonstrate that cedar had been properly seasoned except by waiting years to see if it warped? How could he prove that he had not bribed Ptahhotep except by pointing to the lack of evidence, which skeptics could always dismiss as merely indicating that the bribery had been cleverly concealed? But Userhet's campaign of rumor and innuendo had an unintended consequence, for it drew attention to the contrast between his approach and Khentiamentu's, making people notice that while Khentiamentu focused on improving his work and meeting the requirements set by Ptahhotep, Userhet was spending his energy on attacking his rival, and some observers, particularly those who valued honor and fair dealing, began to question whether someone who relied so heavily on such tactics really deserved the success he had achieved, whether his impressive workshop and his connections with powerful people were built on a foundation of genuine skill, or merely on shrewd manipulation and ruthless elimination of competition. And this questioning, though it did not immediately damage Userhet's position, planted seeds of doubt that would grow over time, gradually eroding the reputation he had worked so hard to establish. Meanwhile, Khenti-Amenti threw himself into completing the burial ship according to the timeline he had agreed upon with Ptahhotep. The treasury had provided an initial payment that allowed him to pay off his most pressing debts and to purchase the remaining materials needed for the interior work, and he had hired additional craftsmen, carefully selected for their skill and reliability, men who shared his commitment to quality and who were excited to be part of a project with such significance. And the workshop once again became a center of intense creative activity, but this time, without the desperate edge that had characterized the earlier phases. Now there was confidence born of official recognition, a sense that their efforts were appreciated and would be rewarded, that they were not struggling against an indifferent or hostile world, but were instead contributing to something that mattered, something that the kingdom's highest officials considered worthy of support. The interior of the burial ship took shape with agonizing slowness, for every detail required not just technical skill, but also careful consultation with Amenhotep to ensure religious correctness. The walls were covered with scenes from the Book of the Dead, showing Pharaoh's soul being judged by Osiris and the 42 divine assessors, each god rendered in the traditional manner with the correct symbols and attributes. The hieroglyphic texts carefully painted by a scribe who specialized in funerary inscriptions. Each character formed with precision and artistry, for any error in these sacred texts could have catastrophic consequences for the deceased's journey through the afterlife, turning protective spells into curses or misdirecting the soul away from the blessed fields and toward the demons that lurked in the darkness of the underworld. And Khenti-Amenti supervised every aspect of this work personally, checking and rechecking to ensure that nothing was overlooked or executed carelessly. Understanding that in matters of such spiritual importance, there was no room for the kind of minor imperfections that might be acceptable in ordinary vessels. As the burial ship neared completion, Khenti-Amenti received an unexpected visit from Denel, the Phoenician trader who had been supplying the cedar, and Denel brought news that was both alarming and illuminating. "I thought you should know that Userhet approached me again," Denel said, his expression troubled. "He offered me a substantial sum of money, more than I would make from our arrangement over the next year, if I would testify that the cedar I sold you was inferior quality, that I had deceived you about its provenance and characteristics. He wants to undermine your project by claiming that the materials are substandard. And he seemed to believe that as a foreign trader I would be willing to lie for money, that I had no loyalty to you beyond our business relationship, and would therefore cooperate with him if the price was right. And I must admit that his offer was tempting. The amount of silver he was proposing would set my family up very comfortably, would allow me to expand my business significantly. But I refused, not just because it would be dishonest, though that would be reason enough, but because I have been watching what has been happening here in Thebes, watching the way you and Userhet conduct yourselves, and I have decided that I would rather be associated with a man who wins through quality and integrity than with one who wins through manipulation and lies, even if that decision costs me money in the short term. Because in the long term, reputation matters more than immediate profit, and I want to be known as someone who can be trusted, who keeps his word and delivers what he promises." The information about Userhet's attempt to suborn false testimony was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. It fit the pattern of increasingly desperate tactics that characterized his rival's recent actions. But what struck Khenti-Amenti most forcefully was Denel's willingness to sacrifice immediate financial gain in favor of maintaining his integrity. Here was a foreign merchant, someone who had no deep ties to Egypt or to Khenti-Amenti personally, who could have taken the money and departed to Byblos, where any consequences of his dishonesty would be minimal. Yet he had chosen the harder path, the path that required him to turn down a fortune because it was the right thing to do. And Khenti-Amenti felt a deep gratitude and a renewed faith in the fundamental decency of people. a faith that had been tested by all the sabotage and political maneuvering he had endured, but which now seemed validated by this unexpected demonstration of honor from someone who owed him nothing beyond the terms of their business arrangement. "I cannot match Userhet's offer," Kentiamentiu said honestly. "My resources are stretched thin by the burial ship project, and I have little silver to spare. But I want you to know that your integrity will be remembered and rewarded in other ways. I will recommend you to every merchant and official I know. I will ensure that people understand you are a trader who can be trusted absolutely, whose word is more reliable than a signed contract. And in time, I believe that reputation will bring you more business than Userhet's blood money ever could. Because while there are many people who will deal with dishonest traders when it is convenient, there are also many who specifically seek out honest ones when the stakes are high and they cannot afford to be deceived. And you will be known as belonging to that rare category of merchants who value their reputation more than immediate profit." Danelle seemed satisfied with this, understanding that sometimes the best compensation was not silver, but the respect of people whose opinions mattered. And he departed with a promise to continue supplying cedar for any future projects Kentiamentiu might undertake, and to spread word among the Phoenician trading community about his experience, both the attempted bribery by Userhet and the satisfactory business relationship with Kentiamentiu. Information that would shape how other traders chose to conduct their affairs when dealing with Egyptian shipwrights, creating consequences for Userhet that he had probably not anticipated when he made his clumsy attempt to purchase false testimony. The festival of Opet arrived with the usual pageantry and celebration. The streets of Thebes filled with processions of priests and nobles, the sacred bark of Amun carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple, accompanied by musicians and dancers, the entire city given over to religious observance and public festivity, and somewhere in the midst of all this ceremony, Userhet's barge was formally dedicated for use in future temple rituals, blessed by the high priest and admired by the assembled dignitaries. And Kentiamentiu, watching from a distance, as he had no official role in the festivities, felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was disappointment that Userhet had achieved at least part of what he had been working toward, securing the temple's endorsement and cementing his position as a favored craftsman. But there was also satisfaction in knowing that his own project, though different in purpose and still incomplete, had achieved recognition at an even higher level, that he was building not merely a temple barge but a royal burial ship, that his work would ultimately serve Pharaoh himself rather than the temple hierarchy, and in the intricate status calculations that governed Egyptian society, a royal commission outranked even the most prestigious temple project. So while Userhet might be celebrating his success today, Kentiamentiu had reason to believe that his own eventual triumph would be greater and more lasting. But the festival brought an unexpected development that would change the dynamics of the rivalry yet again. During one of the ceremonies, Pharaoh himself made a rare public appearance. For though he was aging and increasingly frail, he understood the importance of showing himself to his people during major religious celebrations, demonstrating that he remained capable of fulfilling his divine duties even as mortality began to lay its claim upon him. And during this appearance, surrounded by his advisors and protected by his guards, Pharaoh spoke briefly about the importance of preparing for the transition to the afterlife, about ensuring that all the necessary arrangements were made while there was still time, that the tomb was properly equipped and the funerary rituals properly planned, and he specifically mentioned that he had been informed about a burial ship being constructed to carry him on his final journey, a vessel that he was told represented the finest craftsmanship available in Egypt, incorporating both technical excellence and religious propriety in a manner that would honor the gods and ensure safe passage through the perils of the underworld. The public mention of the burial ship by Pharaoh himself transformed the project from an approved but relatively obscure undertaking into a matter of intense public interest. Suddenly, everyone in Thebes wanted to know details about this vessel that their divine king had spoken of, wanted to understand what made it so special that it merited royal acknowledgement. And Kentiamentiu found himself thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight, no longer simply a skilled craftsman working in relative obscurity, but a public figure whose work was being discussed in the marketplaces and the beer houses. Analyzed and speculated about by people who had never built anything more complex than a reed raft, but who nonetheless felt qualified to offer opinions about shipbuilding and funerary customs, and this attention was simultaneously gratifying and burdensome, validating his efforts, but also creating pressure to ensure that the completed burial ship lived up to the elevated expectations that Pharaoh's endorsement had created. Userhet, witnessing his rival's sudden rise in public prominence and understanding that the royal mention had effectively elevated Khentiamentiu above him in the hierarchy of prestige, if not yet in actual accomplishment, responded with a boldness that surprised even those who had become accustomed to his aggressive tactics. He petitioned the high priest of Amun-Ra to arrange a direct meeting with Pharaoh, proposing that he be commissioned to build a second burial ship, arguing that a king as great as the current pharaoh deserved not one but multiple vessels, perhaps an entire fleet of funerary boats that would carry different aspects of his being through different regions of the afterlife. The physical body in one ship, the Ka in another, the Ba in a third, each vessel specifically designed for its particular spiritual cargo and decorated accordingly. And this proposal, while extravagant to the point of absurdity in the eyes of many observers, actually had some theological merit, for the ancient texts did speak of multiple aspects of the soul and their separate journeys after death, and Userhet had clearly done his research, consulting with priests and scholars to develop an argument that sounded plausible, even if its true motivation was transparently competitive rather than genuinely spiritual. The petition created considerable debate among the temple officials and palace advisors who would need to assess its merit and make a recommendation to Pharaoh. Some argued that Userhet's proposal was innovative and showed admirable ambition, that it would indeed be fitting for a Reed pharaoh to have multiple burial ships rather than a single vessel, no matter how well crafted, while others suggested that the proposal was really just an attempt to horn in on Khentiamentiu's project, to claim a share of the prestige and royal favor that had flowed to his rival, and that approving it would set a bad precedent, encouraging every craftsman in Egypt to propose grandiose and expensive projects in hopes of royal patronage, turning what should be sober assessment of genuine needs into a competition to see who could flatter Pharaoh most extravagantly. And this debate played out over several weeks, with arguments flowing back and forth through the complex channels of palace politics, while both Khentiamentiu and Userhet waited anxiously to learn whether the proposal would be approved or rejected. During this period of uncertainty, Kawit provided Khentiamentiu with regular updates on the discussions taking place in the palace, using her network of contacts among the scribes and minor officials who staffed the various bureaucracies, and what she reported suggested that opinion was divided fairly evenly, with neither side having a clear advantage. Petahotep opposes the proposal, she told Khentiamentiu during one of their conversations. He argues that the treasury cannot afford to fund multiple burial ships, that resources are limited and must be allocated based on genuine necessity rather than competitive one-upmanship between rival craftsmen, but he is opposed by some of the priests who like the theological argument about multiple vessels for multiple aspects of the soul, and who see this as an opportunity to influence the design of royal funerary equipment in ways that emphasize religious considerations over practical ones. And there are also political considerations. Some officials who owe favors to Userhet, or who have received benefits from him over the years, and who want to support his proposal as a way of maintaining those relationships, so the outcome is genuinely uncertain. It could go either way, depending on how Pharaoh himself reacts when the issue is finally brought to his attention for a decision. The prospect of Userhet building his own burial ship, even if it was nominally for a different aspect of Pharaoh's soul, troubled Khentiamentiu deeply, for it would inevitably lead to comparisons between the two vessels, assessments of which was superior in craftsmanship or religious appropriateness or aesthetic appeal. And while Khentiamentiu was confident in the quality of his work, he also understood that such comparisons were often influenced by factors other than objective merit, by political allegiances and personal relationships, and all the subjective considerations that shaped human judgment. And there was a real possibility that Userhet's vessel, if it was built, would be declared superior simply because Userhet had more allies and more influence, that his long-term investments in cultivating relationships with powerful people would pay off in ways that would override any advantages Khentiamentiu possessed in terms of actual skill and dedication. And this possibility filled him with a sense of frustrated helplessness, the feeling that no matter how hard he worked or how excellent his craftsmanship, external forces beyond his control would determine the ultimate outcome. But then came news that changed everything. Pharaoh had fallen seriously ill, a sudden decline in health that his physicians attributed to an inflammation of the lungs. And while they expressed optimism about his recovery, the very fact that the divine king's mortality was being publicly acknowledged was significant, for it meant that the abstract question of funerary preparations had become urgent. Concrete, no longer something that could be postponed or debated at leisure, but rather an immediate, practical necessity that required swift action. And in this context, the debate about whether to commission a second burial ship became moot, for there was no time to build multiple vessels, barely enough time to complete the one that was already under construction. And Ptahhotep, seizing on this moment of crisis to assert his authority, declared that all resources needed to be focused on ensuring that Khentiamentiu's burial ship was finished as quickly as possible, that any discussion of additional vessels would have to wait until after the immediate crisis had passed, effectively killing Userhet's proposal without formally rejecting it. A bureaucratic maneuver that demonstrated the overseer's political skills, even as it served the practical purpose of concentrating effort where it was most needed. The news of Pharaoh's illness brought a sense of urgency to the workshop that transcended even the intense focus that had characterized the previous months. For now, they were working not toward an abstract deadline, but against the very real possibility that Pharaoh might die before the burial ship was completed, leaving Khentiamentiu responsible for a project that had failed at the most crucial moment, and he drove himself and his workers harder than ever, working through the night by lamplight, sleeping only a few hours before rising to continue the work, and the craftsmen, understanding what was at stake, matched his dedication, some of them moving into the workshop to save the time that would be wasted traveling to and from their homes. All of them united in the determination to finish what they had started, to ensure that their work would serve its sacred purpose and not be rendered irrelevant by the timing of events beyond their control. The final weeks of work on the burial ship were a blur of exhausted effort and mounting anxiety. Every morning brought news from the palace about Pharaoh's condition, sometimes reporting slight improvements that gave hope he might recover fully, other times describing setbacks that suggested the end was near. And these fluctuating reports created an emotional roller coaster that made it difficult to maintain focus. But somehow, they persisted, completing the intricate inlay work on the interior cabin, installing the canopic chest that would hold Pharaoh's preserved organs, painting the final protective symbols on the exterior hull. Each task checked and rechecked to ensure it met the exacting standards they had set for themselves, until finally, on a morning when the sun rose blood red through the haze of the season's first Khamsin wind, Khentiamentiu stood back and looked at the completed burial ship and allowed himself to acknowledge that it was finished, that they had actually done what they had set out to do despite all the obstacles and setbacks, that the vision he had pursued with such obsessive intensity had finally been realized in physical form. The burial ship that stood before him was 40 cubits of perfect craftsmanship, the cedar hull gleaming with resin and gold leaf, the falcon-headed prow rising proudly as though preparing to take flight. The interior cabin decorated with religious texts and protective symbols so carefully executed that they seemed to glow with spiritual power, and Khentiamentiu felt a profound sense of completion, not merely the satisfaction of a job well done, but something deeper, a feeling that he had fulfilled his purpose, that he had created something worthy of the skills his father had taught him and the tradition he had inherited, something that would outlast him and carry meaning long after he himself had passed into the afterlife and stood before the same divine tribunal whose images adorned the burial ship's walls. And in that moment, all the struggles and sacrifices seemed worthwhile, all the debt and anxiety and exhausting labor justified by this tangible proof that excellence was achievable, that vision could be transformed into reality through dedication and skill. Ptahhotep came to inspect the completed burial ship the following day, bringing with him the same experts who had examined it during the earlier inspection, and they spent hours going over every detail, comparing the finished work to the plans and specifications that had been approved, checking that nothing had been altered or compromised in the rush to complete the project before Pharaoh's death. And when they finally concluded their examination, Seneb, the master shipwright whose earlier praise had meant so much, turned to Khenti and said simply, "This is the finest burial ship I have ever seen, and I have seen them all going back 3 reigns. If Pharaoh is not pleased with this vessel, then he is impossible to please. You have created something that will be remembered for thousands of years, that will set the standard by which all future royal burial ships are judged, and I am honored to have been involved in its assessment, even in that small capacity, because it has reminded me of why I chose this profession in the first place, because shipbuilding at its best is not merely carpentry but art, and you are an artist of the highest order." Ptahhotep's official report was more reserved in its language, as befitted a government document, but the substance was equally positive. He certified that the burial ship met all specifications, that the costs had been controlled within the approved budget despite the challenges encountered during construction, that the religious elements were correctly implemented according to expert theological opinion, and that in his professional judgment the vessel represented excellent value for the treasury's investment, fulfilling its sacred purpose, while demonstrating fiscal responsibility, and he recommended that Khenti be paid the final installment of his commission, and that he be considered for future projects requiring the highest levels of craftsmanship and reliability. This recommendation, coming from someone of Ptahhotep's reputation and authority, was effectively a guarantee of future success, for other officials would defer to his expertise and his judgment, making Khenti's workshop the default choice for prestigious commissions that required absolute quality. The presentation of the completed burial ship to Pharaoh was arranged with a ceremonial formality that reflected both the importance of the occasion and the fragile state of the divine king's health. He was carried on a litter to the riverside location where the vessel had been temporarily moored, surrounded by physicians and priests who monitored his condition anxiously, ready to intervene if the exertion proved too taxing, and a small group of high officials and nobles had been invited to witness the presentation. Among them, the high priest of Amun-Ra, the vizier, several military commanders, and of course Ptahhotep, whose endorsement had made this moment possible, and Khenti, standing beside his creation and feeling simultaneously proud and terrified, watched as Pharaoh's litter approached, understanding that the next few hours would determine not just the success of this project, but the entire trajectory of his future career and possibly his life. For if Pharaoh was displeased, if the burial ship failed to meet his expectations or offended him in some way, the consequences could be severe, extending far beyond mere financial loss, to include disgrace and possibly even criminal charges for having wasted royal resources or shown disrespect to the divine king. Pharaoh, when he was helped from his litter and supported by 2 strong attendants who held his arms to steady him, looked even more frail than Khenti had expected. The illness had hollowed his cheeks and dimmed his eyes, making him appear ancient despite being only in his 6th decade, and there was a tremor in his hands that spoke of weakness and declining vitality. But when he looked at the burial ship, when his gaze traveled along the graceful curves of the hull and up to the falcon-headed prow, and then back to the intricate decorations that covered every visible surface, something shifted in his expression. A spark of interest, or perhaps appreciation, that briefly animated his worn features, and he gestured for his attendants to bring him closer, to help him approach the vessel so that he could examine it more thoroughly, and they complied carefully, supporting his weight as he shuffled forward with the slow, deliberate steps of someone whose body no longer obeyed his will with the ease he had once taken for granted. The examination proceeded in silence, except for occasional questions from Pharaoh, directed sometimes to Khenti and sometimes to Amenhotep, who had been invited to explain the religious symbolism incorporated into the design, and Pharaoh's questions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both theological requirements and practical considerations. He asked about the choice of cedar rather than other woods, about the specific texts that had been selected from the Book of the Dead and why those particular passages were considered most important, about the structural integrity of the hull, and whether it would withstand the magical transformations it would undergo during the journey through the afterlife. And Khentiamentiu answered each question as clearly and completely as he could, trying to gauge from Pharaoh's reactions whether his responses were satisfactory, whether the reasoning behind his design choices was being understood and appreciated, or whether he was somehow failing to communicate the depth of thought and care that had gone into every decision. After perhaps an hour of examination and discussion, Pharaoh gestured for a seat to be brought, for his strength was clearly flagging despite his obvious interest in the burial ship. And once he was seated and had rested for a few moments, he spoke in a voice that was weak but still carried the authority of divine kingship. "I have seen many beautiful things in my lifetime," he said, "treasures from distant lands, monuments built in my honor, works of art created by the finest craftsmen in Egypt. But this bury, al-ship, moves me in a way that few of those other things have. Because it represents something more than mere beauty or technical skill, it represents understanding, a comprehension of what it means to die, and what is required to successfully navigate the transition from this world to the next. Whoever designed this vessel understood that a burial ship is not simply a boat, but a sanctuary, a place of transformation, where the physical and the spiritual intersect, where the mortal becomes immortal and the temporal becomes eternal. And that understanding is reflected in every detail, in the way the protective symbols are positioned to guard against specific dangers, in the way the texts guide the deceased through the correct responses to the divine tribunal's questions, in the way the physical structure itself embodies principles of cosmic order and divine harmony. This is not merely craftsmanship, but wisdom, and I am grateful to the gods that they sent me a shipwright who possessed such wisdom, who could create a vessel worthy of carrying a pharaoh into eternity." The words brought tears to Khentiamentiu's eyes, for this was recognition of a kind he had never dared to hope for, acknowledgement not just that he had built something competently, but that he had understood the deeper purpose and meaning of his work, that he had succeeded in creating something that transcended its physical form and touched on spiritual truths. And he felt in that moment a profound gratitude, not only toward Pharaoh for his generous assessment, but toward all the people who had helped make this achievement possible. Neferu and the other craftsmen who had devoted themselves to the project, Kawit who had guided him through the political complexities, Denel who had supplied materials despite the risks, Amenhotep who had ensured religious correctness, Horemheb and Petahotep, and all the others who had provided support and encouragement when it would have been easier to dismiss his ambitions as unrealistic or presumptuous. And he understood that the burial ship was not really his creation alone, but the product of a collective effort, a collaboration among many people who had each contributed their particular skills and knowledge, and that the triumph he was experiencing belonged to all of them as much as to him personally. Pharaoh continued, his voice growing slightly stronger as he spoke about matters that clearly engaged him deeply. "I know that there has been competition among shipwrights to secure royal commissions, that some have sought to advance themselves through political connections rather than through the quality of their work, and I want to say clearly that such approaches do not impress me. I am old enough and close enough to death to have little patience for flattery or manipulation. What matters to me now is substance, not appearance, truth, not pretense. And this burial ship represents substance and truth. It is an honest work, created by someone who cares more about excellence than about personal advancement. And that is the kind of person I want, working on projects that will carry my name into eternity. Therefore, I am directing Petahotep to ensure that Khentiamentiu receives not only the agreed-upon payment for this burial ship, but also a bonus in recognition of the exceptional quality of his work. And furthermore, I am commissioning him to oversee the construction of several smaller funerary boats that will accompany the main burial ship in my tomb, vessels to carry provisions and servants, and all the other necessities for the afterlife. And I want these auxiliary boats to be built with the same attention to detail and religious correctness that characterized the burial ship, for I will not have my eternal rest compromised by inferior workmanship or careless execution of sacred requirements." The announcement of the bonus and the additional commissions sent murmurs through the verdict. Assembled witnesses, for this was an extraordinary demonstration of royal favor, the kind of recognition that would elevate Khentiamentiu from respected craftsman to honored member of the circle of artisans who served Pharaoh directly. And among those witnessing the presentation was Userhet, who had managed to secure an invitation through his temple connections despite not being officially involved in the burial ship project. And the expression on his face as he heard Pharaoh's words was one of barely suppressed rage and humiliation, for everything he had worked for, all his political maneuvering and his attempts to sabotage his rival, had not only failed but had actually backfired, making Khentiamentiu's success even more dramatic by contrast with Userhet's increasingly obvious scheming. And it was clear to everyone present that the competition between the two shipwrights had been decisively resolved, that Khentiamentiu had won not through politics, but through merit, and that this victory would reshape the dynamics of the shipbuilding trade in Thebes and possibly throughout Egypt. In the days following the presentation, as word spread throughout Thebes about Pharaoh's endorsement and the additional commissions, Khentiamentiu found himself inundated with requests from nobles and wealthy merchants who wanted to commission vessels for their own eventual burials. Everyone who could afford it suddenly wanted a funerary boat built by the same craftsman who had created Pharaoh's burial ship, believing that association with royal favor would somehow transfer divine blessing to their own afterlife preparations. And while Khentiamentiu appreciated the business and the validation it represented, he was also careful not to overextend himself, not to accept so many commissions that quality would suffer or that he would be unable to fulfill his obligations to Pharaoh, for he had learned through bitter experience that reputation could be destroyed much more quickly than it could be built, and that maintaining excellence required saying no to opportunities that would compromise standards or spread resources too thin. Userhet, meanwhile, seemed to fade from prominence with surprising rapidity. The combination of his failed schemes against Khentiamentiu and the public demonstration of Pharaoh's preference for honest craftsmanship over political manipulation damaged his reputation in ways that could not be easily repaired. Some of his workers left to seek positions in other workshops, including several who approached Khentiamentiu about employment, and some of his clients began to question whether they were receiving good value for the premium prices he charged, wondering if they were paying for quality or merely for the illusion of prestige. And gradually, the advantages that Userhet had accumulated through years of careful cultivation of relationships and strategic positioning began to erode, not catastrophically, but steadily. A slow decline that was in some ways more devastating than a sudden fall because it allowed him to watch helplessly as everything he had built slipped away piece by piece. One evening, perhaps 2 months after the presentation to Pharaoh, Khentiamentiu was working late in his workshop, making preliminary sketches for one of the auxiliary funerary boats he had been commissioned to build, when he heard footsteps at the entrance and looked up to see Userhet standing there, alone, and looking older than Khentiamentiu remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his posture less confident. And for a moment the two rivals simply looked at each other, years of competition and conflict hanging between them like a physical presence. And then Userhet spoke, his voice rough as though the words were difficult to force out. "I came to see your burial ship," he said, "not the finished version. I know that it has been moved to the palace for final preparations. But the drawings and models, the documentation of how it was built, I wanted to understand what made it so special, what you did that I did not." The request surprised Khentiamentiu, for he had expected Userhet to remain hostile and resentful rather than seeking to learn from his defeat. But he gestured for his rival to enter and led him to the table where the design drawings were kept, unrolling them and explaining the principles that had guided his work. The mathematical calculations that ensured perfect proportions, the consultation with religious experts to ensure correct symbolism, the careful selection of materials, and the meticulous attention to detail in every stage of construction. And Userhet listened in silence, studying the drawings with the eye of an experienced craftsman. And gradually Khentiamentiu realized that what he was witnessing was not merely curiosity, but a kind of education. Userhet was genuinely trying to understand where he had gone wrong, why his approach had ultimately failed despite his advantages in resources and connections. After a long silence, Userhead rolled up the drawings carefully and looked at Kentiamentiu with an expression that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "You built something that mattered to you," he said, "not to impress others or to gain advantage, but because you cared about the work itself, about creating something excellent regardless of whether anyone appreciated it. And I built things to achieve objectives, to win commissions, and defeat rivals, and accumulate wealth and status. And the difference between those two approaches seems small, almost philosophical, but it made all the difference in the outcome. Your burial ship has soul. It has integrity. It feels like it was made by someone who believed in what he was doing. And my barge, for all its expensive materials and elaborate decorations, feels hollow by comparison, like something constructed to meet specifications without any real passion or understanding. And I think people sense that difference, even if they cannot articulate it. They respond to authenticity in ways that have nothing to do with conscious analysis. And that is why you won and I lost, not because you were more skilled, though perhaps you were, and not because you had better connections, because clearly you did not, but because you cared about the right things, and I did not." The admission was remarkable, coming from someone who had fought so hard and so ruthlessly, and Kentiamentiu felt his anger and resentment toward Userhet beginning to soften, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something more complex, a recognition that his rival was also human, also capable of growth and self-reflection, also struggling to find meaning and purpose in work that could be either mere commerce or something approaching art, depending on the spirit in which it was approached. "We both built boats," Kentiamentiu said quietly, "and we both wanted recognition and success. The difference was not in our goals, but in our methods, in whether we were willing to compromise quality for advantage or to sacrifice integrity for expedience, and those choices compound over time. Each small decision to cut a corner or to manipulate a situation or to prioritize appearance over substance adds up until it defines who we are and what we create, and the reverse is also true. Each decision to insist on excellence, even when it is difficult or expensive. Each refusal to compromise standards, even when doing so would be easier. Those choices also accumulate, building a foundation of integrity that eventually becomes visible in the work itself, making it somehow more than the sum of its parts." Userhet nodded slowly, seeming to accept this assessment. And then he did something unexpected. He extended his hand in the gesture of reconciliation, acknowledging defeat, but also seeking a kind of peace. And after a moment's hesitation, Kentiamentiu grasped it, feeling the calluses on his rival's palm, the marks of shared labor that connected them despite their differences. And he understood that this moment represented not just the end of their conflict, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of relationship. Not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. An acknowledgement that they were both craftsmen pursuing the same fundamental calling, even if they had chosen different paths, and that there was room in the world for both approaches even if one had proven superior in this particular contest. In the months that followed, as Kentiamentiu worked on the auxiliary funerary boats and accepted selected commissions from nobles who wanted their own burial vessels, he thought often about his conversation with Userhet and about the lessons he had learned through the entire ordeal of building Pharaoh's burial ship. He had started the project, driven by ambition and a desire to prove himself, to create something so magnificent that his name would be remembered. And those motivations had sustained him through the early stages, when enthusiasm was high and obstacles seemed surmountable. But as the project had progressed and the challenges had mounted, his motivation had evolved, becoming less about personal glory and more about honoring the craft itself, about contributing to a tradition of excellence that stretched back generations and would continue long after he was gone, about creating something worthy of the sacred purpose it would serve regardless of whether his name was ever associated with it. And paradoxically, this shift from ego-driven ambition to craft-centered dedication had been what ultimately brought him the recognition he had originally sought. For people responded to the authenticity and integrity that came from caring about the work for its own sake rather than for what it might bring him. Neferu, whose steady presence and wise counsel had been instrumental in navigating the various crises that had threatened to derail the project, seemed to understand this evolution. And one evening, as they sat together in the workshop after the other workers had departed, sharing beer and watching the sunset paint the Nile in shades of copper and gold, the old carpenter said, "Your father would have been proud of you, not just for building the burial ship and winning Pharaoh's favor, though those are significant achievements, but for growing into the kind of craftsman and the kind of man he always hoped you would become. He used to worry that you were too ambitious, that you wanted success more than you wanted to do good work, that you would sacrifice quality for advancement and end up becoming another userhet. But you proved him wrong. You learned that excellence is its own reward, and that recognition follows naturally from dedication to craft, rather than from pursuit of recognition for its own sake. And that is a lesson that many craftsmen never learn, spending their entire careers chasing approval and status, while never understanding that those things are byproducts of quality rather than goals to be pursued directly." The words moved Khentiamentiu deeply, for he had often wondered what his father would have thought of his choices and his methods, whether Amos would have approved of the risks taken and the debts accumulated, whether he would have seen the burial ship project as a worthy use of the family reputation and resources, or as dangerous overreach that threatened everything previous generations had built. And to hear Neferu, who had known his father better than almost anyone, express confidence that Ahmose would have been proud, brought a sense of peace and validation that was in some ways more meaningful than Pharaoh's endorsement or Ptahhotep's approval, for family legacy mattered. The sense of contributing to something larger than oneself, of honoring those who had come before while laying foundations for those who would come after. Pharaoh died in his sleep on a cool night when the stars were particularly bright. 6 months after the presentation of the burial ship, his passing was peaceful according to those who attended him. A gentle transition from sleep to death, without struggle or apparent pain, and the entire kingdom went into the prescribed period of mourning, 70 days during which his body would be mummified and his tomb prepared for the burial ceremony that would send him on his journey to the afterlife. And during this period, Khentiamentiu and his workers labored to complete the auxiliary funerary boats, ensuring that everything would be ready when the time came to seal the tomb. And there was a solemn intensity to this work, an awareness that they were participating in rituals that connected them to the very foundations of Egyptian civilization, to beliefs and practices that had sustained the kingdom for thousands of years, and that would, the gods willing, sustain it for thousands more. The burial ceremony itself was a spectacle of overwhelming grandeur. The procession from the palace to the Valley of the Kings, involving thousands of participants, priests and nobles, soldiers and servants, musicians and mourners, all playing their prescribed roles in the elaborate choreography of royal death and transformation. And at the center of it all was the burial ship that Khentiamentiu had built, carried on the shoulders of 40 strong men who had been specially trained for this duty. And following it came the auxiliary boats, smaller but equally perfect in their craftsmanship and religious correctness. And Khentiamentiu, watching from his position among the honored artisans who had contributed to Pharaoh's funerary equipment, felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions, pride certainly, but also humility, awe at being part of something so ancient and significant, and a profound sense of completion, of having fulfilled a purpose that was larger than his individual ambitions or desires. When the burial ship was finally placed in the tomb chamber, positioned carefully according to the directions provided by the priests who had studied the sacred texts and consulted the stars to determine the correct orientation, when the last of the grave goods had been arranged and the final prayers had been spoken and the sealed doors had been closed and covered with rubble to protect them from thieves and desecrators, Khentiamentiu stood for a moment in the harsh sunlight outside the tomb entrance and thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From that morning, when he had stood in his workshop holding a piece of acacia and dreaming of cedar, through all the setbacks and struggles and small victories, to this culmination where his work would rest for eternity in the tomb of a god-king, serving its sacred purpose of carrying Pharaoh through the perils of the underworld and into the blessed fields, where the righteous dead dwelt in eternal peace. And he understood that this was what it meant to be a craftsman, not merely to build things, but to serve purposes larger than oneself. to contribute one's skills and dedication to projects that mattered, that connected the temporal world to the eternal, the human to the divine. In the years that followed, Khentiamentu's workshop became the most prestigious in Thebes, sought after by everyone who wanted funerary equipment built to the highest standards, and he trained apprentices who would carry forward the techniques and the philosophy he had developed, teaching them not just how to shape wood and fit joints, but how to approach their work with integrity and dedication, how to care about excellence for its own sake, rather than for the rewards it might bring. And some of these apprentices would go on to become master craftsmen themselves, establishing their own workshops and training their own apprentices, creating a lineage of quality that would persist for generations. And Khentiamentu found deep satisfaction in this legacy, in knowing that his influence would extend far beyond the specific vessels he had built, that he had contributed to raising the standards of the entire craft, and had demonstrated that integrity and quality could triumph over manipulation and political calculation. Userhet, for his part, gradually rebuilt his reputation through a different approach, abandoning the aggressive tactics that had characterized his earlier career, and instead focusing on steady, competent work. He never again achieved the prominence he had once enjoyed, never again won royal commissions or major temple contracts, but he found a measure of contentment in building good boats for ordinary merchants and minor nobles, people who appreciated solid craftsmanship even if they could not afford the kind of perfection that Khentiamentu offered, and occasionally the two former rivals would encounter each other at the harbor or at guild meetings, and they would exchange respectful nods, an acknowledgement of shared history and mutual understanding. And while they never became friends, they achieved something perhaps more valuable, a professional respect that transcended their personal conflict and recognized that both had contributed, in their different ways, to the tradition of Egyptian shipbuilding that connected them to countless generations of craftsmen stretching back to the very dawn of civilization along the Nile. As Khentiamentu grew older, his hair turning gray and his hands becoming knotted with the arthritis that afflicted those who worked for decades with tools and timber, he began to think about his own eventual death and the journey he would take through the afterlife, and he commissioned one of his most talented former apprentices to build his funerary boat, providing detailed specifications but allowing the younger man considerable freedom in the execution, trusting that the principles he had taught would guide the work even without his direct supervision. And when the boat was completed and he examined it with the critical eye of a master craftsman, he saw in it evidence that his teachings had taken root, that the next generation had learned not just techniques but values, not just how to build, but why building mattered. And he felt a profound gratitude for having been given the opportunity to contribute to this continuing tradition, to have added his own chapter to a story that was far older than he was and would continue long after he was gone. The tale of Khentiamentu and the burial ship he built for Pharaoh became one of those stories that craftsmen told to their apprentices, a narrative that illustrated important lessons about integrity and dedication, about the importance of caring for quality over political advantage, about the way that excellence eventually receives recognition even when that recognition is delayed or difficult. And the story was embellished and simplified over time, as stories always are, with some details exaggerated and others forgotten, but the essential truth remained that a shipwright had created something extraordinary through skill and dedication, that he had overcome obstacles and defeated rivals not through cunning or manipulation, but through honest work and refusal to compromise his standards, and that his creation had served its sacred purpose and would rest for eternity in the tomb of a god-king, a testament to what human hands could achieve when guided by skill and inspired by something larger than mere ambition. And in this way, the burial ship became more than just a vessel. It became a symbol, a reminder that the work we do and the choices we make and the standards we maintain all matter, that they add up over time to create legacies that outlast our mortal lives, that they connect us to traditions that stretch back through countless generations and forward into a future we will never see, but can influence through the quality of what we create and the integrity of how we create it. And perhaps that, in the end, was the true meaning of the burial ship, not merely a conveyan, CE, for a dead king, but a demonstration that human effort, when directed toward worthy purposes and executed with dedication and skill, can achieve a kind of immortality, creating things that matter, that endure, that testify to the best of what we are capable of becoming when we choose excellence over expedience and integrity over advantage. And in making that choice, in building that burial ship with every ounce of skill and care he possessed, Khentiamentu had not just served Pharaoh, or honored his craft, or achieved personal success. He had demonstrated what it meant to be fully human, to take the raw materials of the world and the finite time allotted to mortal life, and shape them into something beautiful and meaningful and enduring, something that would carry meaning forward through the ages, like a ship carrying its precious cargo across the waters of eternity, toward destinations unknown but deeply hoped for. And that is perhaps the finest achievement any craftsman, any artist, any human being can aspire to: the creation of works that matter, that last, that testify to the conviction that what we do with our brief time on earth is important, that it makes a difference, that it adds meaning to the universe and contributes to the great ongoing story of human creativity and aspiration that has sustained our species through millennia and will, the gods willing, sustain us through the millennia yet to come.